Chapter 714. The last time he had come to the Imperial College was a few months ago. That day, the spring rain fell. Fan Xian had come to the Imperial College to see who the scholar about the matter of Sun Jingxiu, the Jingdou magistrate. At that time, he had returned to the capital with a peerless achievement. It had truly been glorious and glorious. He had resisted the pressure of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and humiliated Scholar He's will. He had been confident and arrogant, climbing to the second peak of his life. Once the rain stopped and the black umbrella fell, he was recognized by the students of the Imperial College and caused a small commotion. He had escaped from the Qing Temple in the bleak autumn rain. His face was slightly pale, and his arms trembled slightly. Some of the rain had leaked through the cloth umbrella and soaked his clothes, making him look somewhat wretched. Fan Xian had already been stripped of all of his official positions and titles. He had become a proper commoner. Furthermore, the entire Jingdou knew that the emperor was torturing this once glorious young man. The Fan Manor was like a house arrest. No one dared to come to his door or show their support. In a mere few months, his life's circumstances had completely flipped around. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help smiling. Lowering his head and holding the umbrella, he walked past the Imperial College students who were discussing something and headed deeper into the Imperial College. In the rain, the Imperial College appeared particularly beautiful and quiet. Old trees stretched out their old branches on either side of the stone path, providing a rare comfort for the scholars running through the rain. Along the way, the autumn yellow had not yet risen, but the spring green was still there. At dusk, the school bell rang in the distance, clearing one's heart. Fan Xian no longer worried about the Qing Temple ascetic monks chasing him from behind. Putting aside whether or not they could find him while surrounded by hundreds of Imperial College students, the Imperial College was a sacred and important place. Even if the ascetic monks were willing to sacrifice themselves, they probably would not dare to charge in like a butcher and risk a commotion among the scholars. Holding the umbrella, he walked toward the Imperial College. After walking for a long time, he finally came to a relatively quiet place where the teachers were. Fan Xian habitually walked around the long corridor and entered a small courtyard. Passing by the screen wall, he slowly stopped his steps. This was his room in the Imperial College. A few teachers and talented students had been transferred under him. They had been editing books in this courtyard for a number of years. The carriage of books Sir Zhuang Mohan had given Fan Xian had been reorganized in this place and then sent to Shishan Paper Workshop for the final edition. In the end, it was sold at a fair price by the Fan Manor's Dombo bookstore. These years, the work of organizing books had continued, so the Dombo bookstore had been losing money the entire time. However, Fan Xian did not care about this. Just like how he had felt when he saw the bookshelves in Sun Pin Er's boudoir during the Jingdou Rebellion, Fan Xian thought that this kind of thing was meaningful. Since it was meaningful, he would continue to do it. He stood quietly by the screen wall and looked at the movement in the room. He was comforted to find that although the emperor had beaten him into a commoner, the Imperial College teachers and students who had followed him for a number of years had not been implicated. Furthermore, the work of editing books continued and had not been affected. A glimmer of warmth rose in Fan Xian's heart. He gazed into the room and smiled. Before the Imperial College teachers discovered him, he turned and left the familiar courtyard. Slanting through the small hill in the northeast corner of the Imperial College, he followed a shallow lake and came to another familiar courtyard. This courtyard and these rooms were where Xu Wu the scholar had lived when he taught. Later, Hu the scholar had been summoned back to Jingdou by imperial edict and squeezed in. After Xu Wu retired, this courtyard belonged to Hu the scholar alone. The last time Fan Xian had asked for Hu the scholar's help, it had happened in this courtyard. Fan Xian pushed open the door and entered. He bowed to the shocked officials and teachers. He then walked into the study alone, leaving behind the group of people looking at each other in dismay. Hearing someone push open the door and enter, Hu the scholar, who had been buried in his desk, raised his head. He quickly took off the crystal spectacles on the bridge of his nose. His face quickly changed to a solemn expression. The leader of the Qing civil officials was not in a good mood. Given his identity, Hu dared to barge in without summoning him. However, he saw a face he had never expected. After pausing for a moment, a trace of bitterness rose to the scholar's face. This is truly shocking. Fan Xian had actually not expected who the scholar to be in the room. He had been busy in Dongyi for a long time. He had somewhat forgotten his duties for the court meetings and the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He was also not sure whether or not this scholar would be at the Imperial College. However, he did have some things he wanted to talk about with someone. Since he had come to the Imperial College, he had to find this person. In court, the only person who could come into private contact with Fan Xian and not worry about being angrily dismissed by the Emperor was probably this who the scholar. Something's happened today. I'm not in a good mood, so I came to find you to chat. As Fan Xian spoke, he walked in the direction of the desk. The umbrella in his hand dripped water all the way. The scholar furrowed his brows and pointed. Only then did he understand. Smiling, he placed the umbrella behind the door. Without a trace of politeness, he picked up the cup of warm tea on the table and took a few sips, warming his body that had been soaked through by the rain and ice in the Qing temple. How come you are so down and out and pitiful? Looking at the dripping Fan Xian, snatching the hot tea to drink, who the scholar couldn't resist laughing. However, the smile disappeared as soon as it appeared. He found that this joke could easily be extended to other meanings. As expected, Fan Xian very naturally followed along with this topic and said, I am just a commoner now. To be able to drink the hot tea on the scholar's table, I have to treasure the opportunity. After these words were said, the quiet room immediately became silent. Neither of them spoke. Instead, they sank into their own thoughts. Who the scholar thought Fan Xian had come specifically to find him, so he had no choice but to be cautious. Each word and each action had to be carefully thought out before they could be expressed. After a long time, who the scholar looked at him and said, Why did you want to come out for a walk today? A strange smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. His voice was slightly cold. Has the palace ordered me to be confined? Who the scholar smiled. Fan Xian continued warmly, Since there isn't, why can't I come out for a walk? In particular, His Majesty has stripped me of all my duties, but what is very wonderful is that he has left me a teaching position at the Imperial College that has no rank or rank. My coming to the Imperial College today can be considered to be considerate of His Majesty's wishes, to show that this commoner has no resentment. There was resentment in his words. If a normal official had said such words in front of who the scholar would certainly have harshly reprimanded them. Facing Fan Xian, he could only maintain his silence. Of course, the atmosphere of this conversation was completely different from the conversation in the spring rain. After all, although Fan Xian's words were fearless at that time, they were fearless with the Emperor's permission. Who the scholar could still join in the fun. Now, the Emperor had withdrawn this permission. Who the scholar's response was particularly difficult. He paused for a moment and then looked at Fan Xian. Seriously, he said, I'm not very clear about your thoughts. Yesterday, when I entered the palace, I had a conversation with the Emperor. When it came to the matter of the Fan Manor, the Emperor had a comment about you. Fan Xian slowly raised his head and didn't ask. The calmness in his eyes did not match the confusion in his heart. Everything about Enji is good. It is just that his personality is too direct and stubborn. Who the scholar glanced at him and took the teacup from his hand. Leaning slightly, he went to refill the tea on the little stove at the side. Who the scholar had his back to Fan Xian. His voice was flat and indifferent. Quietly, he said, direct and stubborn. It looks like the Emperor understands you and is considerate of you. No matter how big a mistake, it can be washed away with these words. This is a problem of personality, not a problem of natural disposition. You have to understand the Emperor's painstaking efforts. Painstaking efforts? Fan Xian's brows slowly furrowed. They were beautifully furrowed and cold. He understood what who the scholar's words represented. The man in the palace still had 30% hope and 30% tolerance for his illegitimate child. How much of the remaining 40% was anger and how much was fear? No one could say for sure. Who the scholar turned his body and placed the teacup in front of Fan Xian. Looking into his eyes, he said seriously, direct and stubborn. This is a person of character. The emperor likes true lovers like you. It is not that the emperor cannot forgive you for the mistakes you have made these days. What is important is that you know where you went wrong and let the emperor know that you know your mistakes. Fan Xian sat silently in the chair. He knew that Hu the scholar had misjudged his intentions for coming today. However, it was impossible for the two of them to speak openly like they did in the past. He was not stupid enough to argue back. He only unconsciously and slowly said, "Where did I go wrong? You know where it is. You need to show your attitude." Hu the scholar's brows furrowed. With slight worry, he said, "Any of the things you have done these dozen days is enough for you to be struck into the dust and unable to rise again. The Black Knights have passed through the provinces. The memorials accusing you these days have flown into the hall of governmental affairs like snowflakes. Probably the officials in these places still don't know that the emperor has long punished me." Fan Xian smiled. "When has the emperor truly punished you?" Hu the scholar's brows furrowed even deeper. Even a moisturizing cream he had to wear every day was almost unable to hide the deep wrinkles on his forehead. He looked at Fan Xian with a slightly disappointed gaze and said heavily, "If you truly want to be punished according to Qing law, even if you have entered the body of the 8 deliberations, how many heads do you have to chop off? Can it offset these?" Hu the scholar looked at the silent young man in front of him. For some reason, a fire of anger that was difficult to suppress rose in his heart. Lowering his voice, he scolded, "Don't you understand that the emperor has already been sufficiently lenient toward you? If you continue to challenge the power of the court like this and sharpen the emperor's patience, so what?" Fan Xian wouldn't cut off Hu the scholar's words. Hu the scholar looked at him calmly. The disappointment in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. After a long time, he said in a raspy voice, "Do you want to die?" Fan Xian raised his head to look at him. Don't rely on the emperor's favor to continue making trouble without regard for the law and morality. It looked like the scholar was truly angry. As the leader of the Qing civil officials, he had been like the other officials in court these days, watching as the emperor and Fan Xian turned against each other. He watched as the originally beautiful autumn scenery of the Qing kingdom added countless dark clouds because of this sudden change. As a high-ranking official of the Qing kingdom and a citizen of the Qing kingdom, they all wanted to persuade Fan Xian to enter the palace to ask for forgiveness and end this period of unrest. However, the attitude Fan Xian had displayed these days gradually chilled the hearts of everyone, including the scholar. "You think that I am just a favored official?" Fan Xian did not want to brag about his abilities like a child. After hearing these words, he still couldn't resist furrowing his brows slightly and asking, "It has nothing to do with favor. You are just an official. I'm also an official." Hu the scholar forcefully suppressed his anger and faintly said, "You and I are both the emperor's officials. Perhaps you think that the emperor does not treat you well. Think about it carefully. Since the founding of the country, which official has received such favor and trust from you? You have clearly seen the history of the country these years. You should know that the emperor has already shown you the greatest degree of tolerance and patience. Don't be blinded by your power. In the end, your power was bestowed upon you by the emperor. It's not that the emperor can't do anything about your ruthlessness these days. It's just that he doesn't want to, can't bear to, and doesn't want to make those decisions. It's not that he can't." Hu the scholar slowly lowered his eyelids and said in a serious voice, "Of course, I have to admit that you are an exceptional official." Hu the scholar did not finish because he wanted to tell Fan Xian that if the emperor truly did not have a sliver of leniency toward him, perhaps he would have long thrown him into prison or even executed him. The emperor had always had this ability. However, these involved the matters between the emperor and Fan Xian. Hu the scholar's emotions surged. He realized that he had already said too much, so he silently changed the topic. No one wants to see a meritorious official of the Qing kingdom disappear from Jingdou because of his arrogance. Hu the scholar looked at Fan Xian and said solemnly, "One must know when to turn back when one is lost. There has to be a limit to one's stubbornness." These words seemed to have been said not long ago by many Baldies. Fan Xian smiled unhappily and straightened his body. Looks like the present Jingdo and the world all think that I am the little insect in front of the carriage of history. I should either quickly move out of the way or be crushed to death. If I have my own thoughts, then I'm a sinner. He gradually withdrew his smile and thought of the group of wastrels he had crippled outside Bauua brothel many years ago. He also thought of what one had once said was very similar to who the scholars. The emperor's patience, in the end, had a limit. Presently, he was trapped in Jingdo and could not leave. If someone wanted to kill or cripple him, it was only a matter of a word. This was different from the siege of the ascetic monks in the Qing temple. Once the Qing court truly decided to get rid of Fan Xian, this unstable factor, no matter how shocking Fan Xian's cultivation was, he would not be able to escape this fate. After all, he was not a great grandmaster. Earlier, when I braved the rain to enter the Imperial College and watched those scholars walk past me, I thought that perhaps one day I would also become someone worthy of disdain in their eyes. Fan Xian said tiredly with his head lowered. No one has ever blamed you or disdained you. Not only these students, but even the officials and people in Jingdo have some respect for you when it comes to matters on the execution field. Who the scholar coughed and slowly said, just like the emperor's criticism of you, you displayed sufficient stubbornness in the matter of Director Chun. This kind of true nature can make many people understand you. However, you must learn to think through these things. The people respect you only because of your affection. However, if you really do something treacherous and heinous, then, if you truly have any treasonous actions, even thoughts. Who the scholar's voice became icy. I cannot tolerate you. The court cannot tolerate you. The people cannot tolerate you. The emperor cannot tolerate you. You must understand. This is the unified will of the Qing court. I hope you won't mess around. Mess around? Fan Xian smiled, but there was a heavy pressure in his smile. Being the enemy of the world was not something he was afraid of. His heart was still thinking back to the thoughts in his mind earlier. He could not quite come back to his senses. After a long time, he bowed solemnly toward who the scholar. He didn't say anything or give any information. He turned and walked toward the door. Although I don't want to admit it, I have to admit that I'm already old. Who the scholar looked at Fan Xian's back and suddenly blurted out. Slowly, he said, the words I said today were a bit excessive. However, the world is not yet settled. The war cannot stop. For the officials in court and for the people under heaven, I hope you can think more. Who the scholar spoke from the bottom of his heart. He had been the emperor's purposeful choice to be the next prime minister. Following the changes in the situation in court, his prospects had become blurry. In order to oppose Fan Xian, the emperor had raised up his own way. So he understood the emperor's heart and was skilled in government affairs. He was experienced and mature. It was impossible to find a single mistake. Now that Fan Xian's power had declined, his own way had naturally secured his position in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He had the emperor's trust and was popular for a time, faintly suppressing the Hu faction's limelight. Even if Hu the scholar did not care for power and position, he would probably still sigh in his heart. His urging of Fan Xian was probably because he needed a familiar helper in court. Of course, the most fundamental reason was just as he had said earlier. The Qing kingdom, whose sharpness pointed at the world, needed a stable court and a harmonious society. Each day Fan Xian did not lower his head to the emperor. The Qing kingdom would not be at peace unless Fan Xian died. In reality, in the Qing court and in the streets, not many people wanted Sir Fan Jr., who had just accomplished a great deed, to die like this. I understand what you mean. Fan Xian didn't turn his head. After a long silence, he said, perhaps one day I will think it through and enter the palace to ask for forgiveness. Behind him, who the scholar smiled bitterly and thought, if I wait for you to think it through, how many years and months will that take? Perhaps I was truly wrong? Fan Xian's figure at the door was very tired. He quietly muttered to himself in a slightly raspy voice. When these words landed in who the scholar's ears, it made his heart warm. His brows slowly furrowed. He decided to enter the palace again tonight. In his opinion, the dispute between the emperor and Fan Xian was not something that could not be resolved. It was just that no one wanted to lower their head first. If he could convince the emperor to send an edict summoning Fan Xian into the palace, perhaps Fan Xian would go with the flow. As he thought this, Fan Xian suddenly turned his head and said, "Although I am no longer in the Overwatch Council, I know a very interesting piece of news. Perhaps you would like to hear it." The scholar raised his head slightly. Fan Wujiu is a strategist and scholar He's manner. Fan Xian bowed again and walked out of the room. The rain in the Imperial College continued to fall unhurriedly. Under the umbrella, Fan Xian's calm face did not change in the slightest. He had already achieved his goal in his conversation with the scholar. He knew exactly what the upper echelons of court officials thought of him. He also understood where the bottom line of the emperor's generosity toward him was. Of course, the most important thing was the last two sentences. Fan Xian held the umbrella and walked silently in the rain. He thought to himself that if it wasn't tonight or tomorrow, the palace would probably send out an edict summoning him into the palace. Through the scholar releasing some kind of signal into the palace, perhaps he could hide it from the man on the dragon chair. All of this was because the people of the Chinian unit had just left the capital, so Fan Xian was not ready. He had to control this cold war between ruler and official to within the range of spring failing. He was preparing at all times. That night, the scholar entered the palace. No one knew what he said with tears and tears to the emperor, but the eunuchs serving in the royal study all knew that the emperor's mood should be much better. An edict was immediately sent out of the palace. The dark killing field outside the Fan Manor, which had been tormented for 7 days, came to an end. Until Scholar, who left the royal palace with a peaceful and happy expression, he still did not tell the emperor the shocking news Fan Xian had told him. For one reason, he didn't understand why Fan Xian had told him such an important matter. Was there a hidden conspiracy behind it? For another reason, the Qin kingdom was like what the scholar believed. What they needed was unity. In the Imperial College, he only felt that the name Fan Wujiu sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember who it was. After all, he was the head scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. In the time it took to drink a cup of tea, his subordinates found out that Fan Wujiu was one of the 8 generals of the Second Prince's Manor. Walking out of the palace and into the carriage, the scholar couldn't resist sighing. He gently stroked his beard and smiled. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed a cute person who held grudges. Chapter 715. The Emperor waved his hand. The people outside the Fan Manor were all evacuated. This was the power of a feudal ruler. He could do as he pleased. As for the subordinates and officials who had died muddle-headedly outside the Fan Manor because of the battle between him and his father, who would care? The royal study was not quiet. After the scholar left, the emperor began to play chess with Fan Ruo. This was a habit he had developed in recent days. The Qing emperor's index and middle fingers gently picked up a black piece and placed it on the slightly reflecting chessboard. Evenly, he said, "It looks like Fan Jian did not teach you these things in the manor." Fan Ruo had been in the palace for a full 8 days. She was wearing the casual clothes that the Fan Manor had gone to great lengths to send through a few concubines in the palace. They were mainly plain. Compared to the brilliance of the royal palace, they appeared light and incongruous. Although everyone knew that the young lady of the Fan family was a hostage in the palace, this hostage's status was not low. The emperor treated her even more well. Princess Qin managed things outside the palace. Inside the palace, there were nobles looking after her. There were no major problems with her food, daily life, and clothing. She sat respectfully across from the Qing emperor and placed her hands gently on her knees. She replied, "The path of chess is too complicated." The emperor raised his eyelids slightly and asked with interest, "I remember that before Nji entered the capital, you were already a famous, talented woman in Jingdou. It was just those boorish men who liked to make trouble out of nothing who liked to make irresponsible remarks. I can't compose poetry or paint. I really don't know where this talented woman's reputation came from." In her 8 days in the palace, she had gone from the initial nervousness, fear, and helplessness to now waiting quietly and calmly. Fan Ruo had fully released the calmness of an iceberg. For one, it was because of her personality from a young age. More importantly, it was because of Fan Xian's imperceptible influence over these dozen years. Although the man opposite her was the Qing Emperor, he was still a person and not a monster. This was also because the Emperor appeared particularly like a normal person in front of Fan Ro. I've seen your poems. They're not bad in the boudoir. However, compared to Nji, they cannot be compared. No wonder you would say such things, the Emperor said with a slight smile. Her Majesty smiled and said, talent does not lie in showing off one's various abilities, but in the steadfastness of one's heart. You saved my life, which can be considered a miracle. It is fitting to be called a talented woman. Your Majesty has a flood of good fortune. I'm just... Fan Ro naturally followed the tone of the Emperor's words. Unexpectedly, the Emperor smiled and said, of course I won't die, but I don't think it will be comfortable to have more steel balls in my body. Eunuch Yao quietly flashed into the royal study and stood in front of the Emperor. In a quiet voice, he said, someone died in the Qing temple. They are waiting in the front hall. Wait, is it a punishment? The Emperor gently played with a black, matte chess piece. In a cold voice, he said, I will spare them this time. If they act rashly again, have them go jump off the cliff at Dong Mountain. Eunuch Yao agreed in a low voice and said, after Sir Fan Jr. left the Qing temple, he went to the Imperial College and saw who the scholar. The Emperor was silent for a moment. He then smiled slightly and said, I already knew earlier. At the Qing temple, the shadow has returned. Eunuch Yao was silent. When it came to these matters, he did not have any power to make suggestions. He understood the Emperor's intentions. He would not be as muddle-headed as those ascetic monks wearing straw hats. Who was Fan Xian? He was the Emperor's favorite official and illegitimate child. Even if the Emperor wanted Fan Xian to die, he would not let the people below him act on their own. The problem is we still don't know how Sir Fan Jr. left the Fan Manor or how he entered the Qing temple. Furthermore, we don't know where he went during this period of time, Eunuch Yao said as he bowed slightly. The Qing Emperor furrowed his brows slightly and didn't say anything. He waved his hand and had Eunuch Yao leave the royal study. During the course of this conversation, Fan Ro listened quietly to the side. Eunuch Yao did not avoid her. These days, the servants in the palace had long gotten used to the Emperor always having a girl with delicate features and a sense of calmness emanating from her body listening. Regardless of whether it was a royal study meeting or more important state affairs, the Emperor did not avoid her. However, the person they were talking about was, after all, Fan Xian, her dearest brother. Thus, Fan Ro still lowered her head slightly. It was as if she did not want to hear any of this. Furthermore, she did not want the Emperor to discover anything strange. The Emperor did not glance in her direction. He was silent. A moment later, the Emperor suddenly smiled slightly. The internal court did not find any trace of what Fan Xian had done after risking his life to leave the manor. At least, they knew that the shadow of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had returned. In the Qing temple, a dozen ascetic monks had fought a great battle with the two of them. Thinking of the bald ascetic monks, the smile on the Emperor's face immediately faded. A glimmer of disgust rose to his eyes. He had not thought that these fanatical Qing temple cultivators would dare to attack Fan Xian without asking for the Emperor's orders. This made the Emperor feel a considerable amount of displeasure. Thinking of the shadow, the true head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. A glimmer of interest appeared. Chen Pingping had served him for decades, but he had always kept many of his secrets. In the past, because the Emperor deeply believed in his loyalty, he did not care much. Although he knew that there had always been a shadow floating by the side of the black wheelchair, the Emperor did not investigate deeply into the shadow's true origins. Now he knew. A light flashed across the Emperor's eyes. It was the sword light the white-clothed swordsman had sent out a few years ago in the Hanging Temple. This light was piercing to the eyes and made him narrow his eyes even more. He faintly hoped in his heart that Sigu Jian's youngest brother would do something. There was no need to consider what Fan Xian had done when he left the manor. The emperor knew that Fan Xian must have gone to contact his most trusted subordinates in Jingdo. At the same time, he had sent some important messages in the direction of Shiliang, Dongyi, and Jiangnan. This was a simple matter. If Fan Xian wanted to maintain his independence in front of the pressure of the dragon chair, he had to mobilize all of his power. However, the emperor could not be bothered to pay attention to the specific contents of the messages. In his opinion, no matter how Fan Xian jumped, he was still on this land. This land had always been in the Qing emperor's hands. Furthermore, the emperor was very curious about what his favorite and most admired son could do when he was under house arrest in Jingdo. If he was facing Yi Qingmei of the past, for the sake of the people of this land, for the survival of the entire Qing kingdom, and for the wishes of too many people, perhaps there would be no need for him to say anything. Yi Qingmei could only silently go far away and no longer exist on Qing kingdom soil. What choice would his and Yi Qingmei's son make? This was something the emperor was very interested in. Was this the evil interest of calmly watching the struggle of the next generation under a kind of absolute confidence? However, up until now, the emperor had never thought of throwing Fan Xian into the abyss. In his opinion, his son had only misunderstood him. The emperor just didn't want to explain. He didn't care to explain. This was a process of questioning his heart. He sat tyrannically in the palace and waited for Fan Xian to enter the palace to explain and beg for forgiveness. Only then would the emperor peacefully tell Fan Xian that the dead old black dog was not as benevolent as he imagined. That old black dog only wanted to kill the entirely royal family. He had once killed him. Although his surname was Fan, in reality, it was Li. Something like that? But how would he explain Yi Qingmei's matter? Perhaps the emperor did not want to touch on that. "I want to go out for a walk," the emperor said. Although his voice was calm, it was clear that because of what the scholar had said when he entered the palace earlier, the emperor had some confidence in dealing with Fan Xian's matter. Thus, his mood was relatively relaxed. That was why he wanted to go out in the middle of the night. There were only 2 people in the royal study. Naturally, the emperor's words were for Fan Ruo to hear. Fan Ruo was slightly startled. She stood and took out a thin cloak lined with black fur and gold. Carefully putting it on for the emperor, she then supported his right arm and slowly walked to the side of the wooden door of the royal study. When the wooden door opened, there were already a dozen eunuchs and serving girls waiting outside. Eunuch Yao humbly lowered his body and pushed a wheelchair as he waited. From the time the emperor spoke to the time the eunuchs outside finished preparing everything, it had all taken a very short time. Their reactions were very fast. The emperor looked at the wheelchair outside the door and did not show a trace of admiration on his face. He only glanced coldly at Eunuch Yao and paid no attention to the servants outside. With Fan Ruo's support, he walked toward the royal palace in the night. Being stared at by the emperor coldly, Eunuch Yao's body was covered in cold sweat. 8 days had passed. Not many people knew that the battle between ruler and officials in the royal study had caused the emperor serious injuries. Although it was not life-threatening, the emperor's body had still suffered injuries that were difficult to recover from in a short time. Additionally, Chun Pingping's heart-wrenching words that day made the emperor's mental state not particularly good. Thus, Eunuch Yao had prepared this wheelchair. He had not expected that the emperor would be so unhappy. He immediately realized that regardless of whether it was because he did not want the officials to know the true state of his body, or because the wheelchair made him think of the old director who had made the emperor angry and pained, Eunuch Yao had made a big mistake. This kind of mistake could not be made. Fortunately, the emperor was a master who was more magnanimous towards servants than his own family. He would not easily shift his anger, so Eunuch Yao did not have to worry about his life. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. Leading a group of eunuchs and serving girls, he quietly followed behind. Looking at the young lady of the Fan family gently supporting the emperor forward, no one dared to get too close. The lanterns hanging in the corridors of the royal palace were not very bright. They were only used to illuminate the stone path beneath their feet. Usually, once night fell, the nobles would shut themselves up in the palace and not come out. Only the eunuchs and serving girls who had work to do would walk along these quiet, long corridors. Today, the slightly dim light shone on the Emperor and Fan Ruo's bodies, dragging out long and short shadows. It made the eunuchs and serving girls they met tremble with fear and hurriedly kneel by the side of the path. Just as Eunuch Yao had guessed, the Emperor's earlier displeasure was because of the wheelchair by the door of the royal study. Once he saw the wheelchair, the Emperor naturally thought of the old black dog in the wheelchair who often walked side by side with him in the royal palace in the dead of night. As if they were talking about family matters, they discussed the situation of the world, the internal strife of the royal family, drew up plans, and estimated the number of deaths. The Qing Emperor was human. He greatly missed those scenes of the past. Because of this and Chen Pingping's betrayal, these beautiful scenes worth remembering suddenly had an extra layer of strangeness and disbelief. Thus, he felt angry. Other than anger, there was also a thread of complicated emotions in his heart. A few years ago, because of the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian had been heavily injured and almost lost his life. After he had recovered, that young man had also entered the palace in a wheelchair and talked with the Emperor for a long time. That was the first time the Emperor had spoken with Fan Xian. Although they still did not explicitly state their relationship and were not like the time in the little building, for the Qing Emperor, it was still an important meeting. Seeing the wheelchair knight, he thought of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian after his injury. His emotions became complicated. Slowly, he said, "The reason I wanted to cut that old dog to pieces was because he was extremely ruthless and extremely deceitful." Fan Ruo held his arm and maintained a distance. She did not feel it was too tiring. Hearing these words, she felt that the Emperor's body had become as heavy as Mount Tai. If a ruler wanted an official to die, the official had no choice but to die. In particular, Director Chen's rebellious actions were clear to the heavens and earth. No one could use this matter to question the Emperor other than Fan Xian. More importantly, the Emperor did not need to explain anything. Just like these days, he never thought of taking the initiative to explain anything to Fan Xian. However, on this early autumn night, just as she and the Emperor were alone, the Emperor had spoken. Were these words meant for her to hear, or was he borrowing her mouth to say it to his brother? Fan Ro lowered her head slightly and didn't reply. She was thinking endlessly in her heart. In the end, that old dog purposely died at my hands so that Ji would resent and hate me. How could I allow such an evil person to die happily? The Emperor's voice was slightly tired. He turned his head and glanced at Fan Ruo. He then turned his head back and looked at the quiet palace. "Tomorrow, I will give an order for Ji to enter the palace to pay his respects." Fan Ruo's figure froze slightly. With one hand holding the Emperor's arm, she crouched down slightly and curtsied. Sincerely, she said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." The Emperor's face was expressionless. It was as if he did not think that in this Cold War, he was the first to take a step back and still needed the daughter of an official to express her thanks. What moved him a little was that after the young lady of the Fan family said these 3 words, she did not say anything else. She only held his arm and continued to stroll through the palace. She did not say a word about her leaving the palace. "You are different." The Emperor turned his head and glanced at her with deep meaning. "In the past, I often came with Chun to stroll through the palace. However, as she grew older, I came less often. Furthermore, she is much more mischievous than you. Naturally, I cannot compare to sister-in-law." Fanro lowered her head and replied quietly. The Emperor smiled and didn't say anything. He felt that the little girl beside him was extremely light and boastful. However, it was also pitiful. Ever since Lin Warner had grown up, there were probably not many people who would accompany the Emperor like a true junior. Because the Emperor had no family matters, in the hearts of the princes, whether alive or dead, their father could never be a true father. Fan Ruo's heart was also filled with confusion and emotion. After these days of interaction, this unfamiliar and incomparably dignified Emperor seemed to gradually come down from the altar. He also took off the dazzling golden outer clothing and became more like a normal elder. Perhaps it was more accurate to say that he was an elder who had been seriously injured and was gradually showing signs of old age. In the quiet night palace, the young lady of the Fan family supported the emperor for a stroll. This scene fell into the eyes of many people. This was not the first time people had discovered that the emperor treated the young lady of the Fan family strangely. Ever since the emperor had been injured in the royal study and the young lady of the Fan family had entered the palace to be treated, everyone in the royal palace knew that the emperor treated her differently. Anyone with a bit of intelligence knew that the young lady of the Fan family was currently a hostage. However, there were no more hostages like that in this world. Her life in the palace followed Princess Chen's rules. Other than returning to the palace to rest at night, the young lady of the Fan family would spend the entire day with the emperor in the royal study. Even when the emperor discussed state affairs, he did not avoid her. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were also shocked by this scene. However, they were all people of status, so they would not spread rumors. However, Scholar's expression would often appear unnatural when he saw the young lady of the Fan family in the royal study. It was different inside the royal palace. There were many people and many mouths. For a moment, there was much discussion. Humans were always a forgetful species. Perhaps the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace had already forgotten the thunderstorm in the 7th year of the Qing calendar and the bloody purge in the palace because of rumors. They had once again thrown themselves into the great work of gossip. Perhaps it was because too many people had died 3 years ago. At this time, many new eunuchs and serving girls had entered the royal palace. They did not know the danger hidden in the royal family's bearing. Perhaps it was because the emperor's attitude toward the young lady of the Fan family was truly incomprehensible. Rumors about the royal study gradually spread throughout the royal palace. The emperor was a wise ruler who did not like women, and he did not seem like a licentious master. In these years, there had only been a dozen female masters in the royal palace, and only 4 had children. Logically speaking, no one would have guessed that. However, the emperor's attitude toward the young lady of the Fan family was truly different. In addition, there had been another major event in the royal palace in the last 2 days. It couldn't help but touch the hearts of too many people. This major event was the consort selection. The consort selection that had begun 3 days ago. The Qing royal palace had stopped consort selection activities for over a dozen years. No one understood why the emperor would suddenly have the idea of filling up the back palace at such a time. Was it because the crisis of approaching middle age had made this ruler suddenly think of a youthful madness? Starting from 3 days ago, the consort selection, hosted by Taichung Temple and coordinated by the Internal Court and the Ministry of Rights, began. Since the Qing kingdom was already unfamiliar with this entire process, the Ministry of Rights appeared to be in a panic. The 7 roads and provinces of the Qing kingdom had probably not received the edict yet. The women who might have been lucky enough to be selected into the palace had not heard any news. Thus, the first to move was still Jingdo. This was a rare opportunity. The nobles, officials, and famous scholars who had been dormant in Jingdo for too long all wanted to grasp this opportunity. Amidst this chaotic process, they still rushed to send the first batch of women of suitable age into the palace on the night before yesterday. Because of the arrival of the youthful and graceful women, the royal palace, which had been peaceful for many years, immediately gained a youthful and threatening feeling. Even though it was already night, clear laughter still rang out from the courtyards where the women were. The overflowing feeling of spring filled the palace at the beginning of autumn. Thus, the people in the royal palace cast suspicious gazes toward the royal study. If the emperor's heart was truly moved, how would the young lady of the Fan family, who had won the emperor's heart, be settled? They're all a group of idiots. Igwe Ping's eyelids drooped slightly. Gently pulling on the 3rd prince's hand, she smiled coldly and said, "Who is the emperor? Who is your teacher? How could such absurd words come out of the palace? Most of the people in the palace are idiots. Furthermore, there are too many new people. Perhaps they have already forgotten many things." The 3rd prince, Li Chengping, smiled. This young prince's smile was a bit forced. There was a faint worry between his increasingly bright brows. Iguapin looked at her son and sighed softly. His Majesty is a wise ruler. Naturally, he would not do such absurd things. The selection of beauties to enter the palace this time has nothing to do with that person in the royal study. Your father is only. Before she finished speaking, Li Changping raised his head and looked at his mother. Gloomily, he said, I heard that father will summon you into the palace tomorrow, but the selection of women. I'm afraid father will not be able to trust you as much as he did in the past. For the story, Fan Ruo's presence in the palace was a very important matter to prevent that person from becoming less and less human. As for the selection of women, it was a problem of the fertility machine. The Qing emperor was not an absurd person, but he was someone who planned far ahead. It was normal for the third prince to be worried about this. Chapter 716. Hearing these words, Iguapin shook her head helplessly. Raising her slender fingers, she gently rubbed her slightly stuffy brows. She didn't know what to say. Of course, she knew what Li Changping's words meant. However, as the emperor's concubine, she, a girl with an innocent and unaffected nature, was only able to sit safely in her current position because Lady Lu had urged her to be quiet before she entered the palace. In this chaotic situation, she couldn't say anything. The present royal palace had completely changed since 3 years ago. The Empress Dowager was dead, the Empress was dead, and the eldest princess was also dead. Lady Shu was secluded in the cold palace. During the Jingdo Rebellion, Iguapin, who had given birth to Li Changping, and Ning the Talented, who had given birth to the Great Prince, followed Fan Xian, and the Great Prince's bravery were being forced to stand on the emperor's side. With the rebellion, the two nobles rose in status. Ning the Talented was raised a level. Although Iguapin was still Iguapin, as she grew older, she would gradually be promoted to a Guifei. The imperial palace was managed by Iguapin and Lady Ning. Iguapin had a good temperament, and Lady Ning did not care about internal affairs. Naturally, the imperial palace was a peaceful place, and they lived 3 good years. However, 8 days ago, there was a loud crash in the imperial study, and the good days finally came to an end. Because Lady Ning had bravely pleaded for mercy on behalf of old Director Chun, she had been banished by the emperor to the cold palace to accompany Lady Shu. It was fortunate that she had given birth to a good son. Otherwise, given the emperor's anger that day, immediate death would have been the best result. Presently, Iguapin was the only noble mistress in the palace. The concubine selection that had begun 3 days ago was under her sole control. She understood the true purpose behind this sudden concubine selection better than anyone else. After the Jingdo Rebellion, the emperor still had 2.5 sons. Other than the Great Prince and Third Prince Li Changping far away in Dongyi, the other half naturally referred to Fan Xian. Because of Chun Pingping's rebellion, Fan Xian and the emperor had sunk into a cold war. No one knew how this matter would end. These 2.5 sons had completely learned the lessons of the Crown Prince and Second Prince. The relationship between them was very close. Putting aside the friendship between the Great Prince and Fan Xian, even the teacher-student relationship between Fan Xian and the Third Prince was stronger than the emperor had expected. After the 7th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had entered the palace many times. However, his contact with the Third Prince had decreased. One reason was because the Third Prince was clearly the heir apparent, so he had to avoid suspicion. The other reason was that the emperor had purposely weakened Fan Xian's influence on the Third Prince. Even if Fan Xian was completely useless, he had one strength that everyone admired. It was his ability to influence the people around him and make them focus their hearts on him. Regardless of whether it was some of the officials close to the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian's 4 disciples, or the troops in Baiwa Brothel, they all proved this point. The Third Prince was his student. Although he had seen little of Fan Xian after returning from Jiangnan, he had not forgotten Fan Xian's teachings. He had long changed from the sinister and ruthless child of the past to a reserved prince. There was no internal strife or jealousy between the 3 princes. If this had happened in the past, this would have been a wonderful thing. After the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, The Qing emperor had reflected on himself and presumably had no interest in driving his sons crazy. However, the revelation of Chun Pingping's rebellion made this seemingly wonderful relationship no longer so wonderful in the emperor's eyes. Iguipin knew this very well. If the emperor no longer completely trusted Fan Xian, then he had to be wary of whether his sons would band together and do something. Even if these three sons could not band together, if the emperor actually made a move against Fan Xian and chilled everyone's hearts, what would the situation in the royal palace be like when Xingping grew up day by day? Thus, the emperor wanted a concubine and more birthing machines in the palace to help him give birth to a few more sons. Iguipin glanced at her son. Her brows were full of worry as she gently sighed. Li Xingping did not sigh. He only gently held his mother's hand. There were many sinister things in the palace. Ever since he was young, he had grown up like this. He had watched helplessly as his two brothers wanted to kill him and his father for that chair. In the end, he had been saved by his other two brothers. He had long discovered that if the royal palace was more peaceful, life would be much smoother. However, there had never been such a good thing in the world. He knew that his connection to the Fan Manor was too deep. If his father no longer trusted Fan Xian, he would probably not be at ease leaving the world to him so easily. Pick a beauty to enter the palace? Did his father want to have a few more sons? Was he wary of him? Or was he wary of Fan Xian? Tomorrow, Sir will enter the palace to pay his respects. Perhaps things will not be so bad. Li Chengping forced a smile and comforted his mother. Fan Xian is very stubborn. Who knows whether or not he will enter the palace tomorrow? Iguipin smiled helplessly. She knew that even if the emperor wanted to have a few more sons to warn Shufang Palace and Fan Xian, that was a matter for a long time. Furthermore, the Qing court had long gotten used to Li Changping being the future Qing emperor. His position was even more stable than the crown prince's. The emperor would not stop the future he had planned for a long time just because of his distrust of the Fan Manor. However, she truly did not know where the true problem between the emperor and Fan Xian lay. Was it Director Qin's death or something else? If Fan Xian was willing to admit his guilt and lower his head, as long as he could continue to live in Jingdou, his power and position would slowly recover. Then, Shufang Palace would not need to worry about these beauties that had been sent to the palace by officials and nobles. The tips of Iguipin's brows furrowed slightly. A rare iciness suddenly flashed through her eyes. It's good if these girls know their place. If they truly want to use the little power their paternal family has in court to stir up trouble in the palace, I will not tolerate them. After all, she was a woman who had been the nominal mistress of the palace for 3 years. No matter how innocent and unaffected she was when she presided over the consort selection, most of it had long been worn away in the palace. At this moment, her cold words naturally revealed a bit of dignity. I heard that when the beauties entered the palace yesterday, Mother chased 3 of them out, Li Changping said sincerely. After all, this is Father's wish. If you do it too obviously, I'm afraid Father will not be happy. Even if your father knew, he would still be happy. Those girls without any discernment. Iguipin smiled coldly. The court hasn't had concubines in a long time. From Taichung Temple to the Board of Rites, there are no rules at all. All kinds of girls are sent into the palace. I don't know what they heard in their paternal family, but once they enter the palace, they threw out large amounts of silver. Those serving maids and nannies probably haven't eaten this kind of silver in a long time, and they actually accepted it. She gazed at the third prince and calmly said, as soon as those beauties entered the palace, they asked about the situation in the palace. They didn't discuss much about the masters of the palace, but when it came to the person in the royal study, they dared to say anything. In the end, it wasn't some proper official. They were all old officials of the nobility that were about to fall. They probably didn't know what the Fan and Lu families were, and naively thought that the Fan Manor had truly lost power. But for some reason, that person received the emperor's favor, so they turned their words toward that person. Who knows how unpleasant their words were? I chased those 3 beauties out of the palace to give the rest a warning and to protect their families' lives. Iguipin gently tucked a strand of hair at the side of her temple and faintly said, putting aside how angry the emperor would be if he actually heard this kind of discussion. If these words reached Fan Xian's ears, once things settle, how miserable do you think these beauties will be in the manor? Li Changping finally couldn't resist laughing and said, "If the recent situation really calms down, I'm afraid Mother will have to add oil and vinegar to her story for you to hear." Iguipin beamed with joy and spat. "This child is speaking nonsense. Mother is not that kind of person." Li Changping scratched his head and said, "But father always leaves the young lady of the Fan family in the royal study. It is not in line with the rules." Iguipin was silent for a long time and then smiled. She didn't say anything. In reality, she knew that the man who had turned her into a woman, the most powerful man in the world, could actually only feel lonely. In his eyes, the women in the palace all seemed to have demands. Perhaps only the young lady of the Fan family, who had nothing to do with the royal palace, could make him truly feel that he had nothing to ask for. What the emperor liked was for the people beside him to not ask for anything from him. Thinking of this, Iguipin's expression became dull. She gazed at Li Changping and warmly said, "You shouldn't go to the cold palace too often. Be careful that the emperor is not happy. Lady Shu has been banished to the cold palace, but in the end, she is second brother's birth mother. In the past, she has treated us brothers well. It has nothing to do with what second brother has done," Li Changping explained in a low voice. "Now that Aunt Ning has also been banished to the cold palace, I have to go see." Iguipin smiled and didn't say anything more. She knew that the reason the third prince often went to the cold palace to visit and gained a reputation in the palace for being benevolent, as well as the emperor's unexpected admiration, was all because of Fan Xian's orders. During the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, it was said that Fan Xian had personally promised the dying second prince to take care of Lady Shu for him. In Shufang Palace, the mother and son quietly talked about the concubines and the girl in the royal study. At the same time, the girl in the royal study had already helped the emperor, who had yet to recover, walk one round and was about to return to the royal study. Just as Iguipin had said, the emperor only admired this girl and would not absurdly have any other thoughts. He had already entered the realm of a great grandmaster and had long seen through the matters between men and women. The reason for the concubines was mostly due to political considerations. On the stroll, the emperor would not talk to Fan Ro about the concubines. He only casually discussed the storm in Jingdo, these 8 days, and Fan Xian's matter. Most of the time, it was the emperor talking and Fan Ro listening. The emperor had been raised by the Fan family's grandmother, so he had a natural closeness to the Fan family. The emperor had never had a daughter in this life. After Lin Wana moved out of the royal palace, it seemed that he could no longer find this relatively warm feeling. The two of them walked in front, while eunuch Yao and a group of people followed nervously from a distance. Strolling in the dark night, this group inevitably looked a bit laughable. Just as they were about to turn into the stone door in front of the royal study, the emperor stopped his steps and looked at the bowed eunuch beside the stone door. After a long silence, he asked, "How have you been with eunuch Dai recently?" This eunuch was once a popular person in the royal study, Hong Zhu. After the matter from 3 years ago had faded, he had been following eunuch Dai on paper-related errands. Coincidentally encountering the emperor in the night, he had waited to the side with complicated emotions. Unexpectedly, the emperor would suddenly greet him. He quickly replied in a trembling voice. The emperor glanced at him with satisfaction. Back then, he had greatly liked this quick-witted little eunuch. Otherwise, he would not have allowed him to personally follow in the royal study. Later, he had sent him to the Eastern Palace to be the head eunuch. It was only because of some coincidental matters that Hong Zhu had fallen into. Even so, the emperor still did not kill him. Suddenly, the emperor's heart jumped. He thought of when he saw the wheelchair earlier and the scene of Fan Xian entering the palace on that snowy day. The little eunuch pushing the wheelchair had been Hong Zhu. Gradually, a glimmer of a smile flashed through the emperor's eyes. He remembered that Fan Xian seemed to dislike this little eunuch a lot in the past. No one knew what he was thinking. He opened his mouth and ordered, "From tomorrow onwards, return to the royal study." Hong Zhu was overjoyed. He knelt on the ground and vaguely gave his thanks and kowtowed. No one noticed a complicated expression flash through his lowered eyes. The emperor waved his hand in annoyance and followed Fan Ruo through the stone door. The emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Snow and rain, there's no need to kneel when seeing me. This is a rule I set after I ascended the throne. It has rained today, but the ground is still wet, so Hongzhu does not need to kneel." Fan Ruo glanced at the emperor in surprise. She didn't know why the emperor was saying this. Am I really not a good emperor? Just as they were about to walk out of the royal study, the emperor suddenly stopped his steps and asked calmly and seriously. If there was a question, there would be an answer. At this moment, there was only Fan Ruo by his side, so he was waiting for her to make a judgment. Fan Ruo's heart trembled slightly. She thought to herself that she was not a great scholar of state affairs or a scholar with a brush of history. How could she have the right to judge such an important question? However, the emperor did not take a step. He only calmly waited for her to speak. Fan Ruo was silent for a long time. She thought of everything she had seen in the royal study these days, as well as the various details in the royal palace. She thought of the lives of the Qing people in the provinces she had seen as she traveled the world. In the end, she could not hide her eyes in sincerity. After thinking for a moment, she gently opened her lips and replied seriously, "Compared to the previous emperor, the emperor is indeed a good emperor." The emperor was silent for a moment and carefully savored Fan Ruo's words. A moment later, his expression relaxed and he laughed loudly. His laughter echoed in the garden in front of the royal study, under the eaves, and then collided with the palace wall before crashing back. Eunuch Yao and the others following behind him were slightly startled. They didn't know what the young lady of the Fan family had said to make the emperor laugh so happily. It was a happiness he had never felt before. For a moment, all sorts of feelings were mixed. They admired this young lady of the Fan family, who rarely spoke. Fan Ruo also smiled slightly. Looking at the emperor beside her, complicated emotions rose in her heart. She finally understood why the emperor had treated her so differently these days. Perhaps Igui Pin had guessed some of it, and Fan Ruo had also guessed some of it earlier. Fan Xian's thoughts were not wrong. However, the emperor had kept Fan Ruo in the royal palace, by his side, in the royal study, and had her watch him manage the power of the country despite being heavily injured. Perhaps it was just that after his conversation with Chun Pingping in the royal study, the emperor needed someone to prove that he was a good emperor. No matter what that old dog in the wheelchair said, he was still a good emperor, was he not? The emperor seemed to have finally made up his mind. A confident and calm smile rose to his face again as he walked toward the royal study. Summoned the imperial college teacher, Fan Xian, into the palace. Some were rough and some were as sharp as a duck, but the loud calls were all the same. There were no court meetings, and it was a regular day off. The royal palace was silent. The imperial army generals and soldiers' expressions were solemn. They did not look sideways and allowed the young man in green robes to walk past them. However, what did not match their calm expressions was their nervousness. 9 days had passed since Chun Pingping's treason was exposed, and he was killed by 1,000 cuts on the execution field in front of the palace. That day, Sir Fan Jr. had killed his way into the execution field and looked down on the emperor's authority. This had already made clear Sir Fan Jr.'s attitude on this matter. In the following days, the Cold War between the emperor and the powerful officials of the Qing court had developed to its peak. Countless spies the internal court had scattered outside the Fan Manor died tragically. According to rumors in officialdom, there had been an assassination attempt on Fan Xian 3 li outside. When the news of the emperor summoning Fan Xian into the palace to pay his respects was revealed, everyone let out a breath. Although the Qing kingdom was powerful, they still did not want to bear the burden of the bloodshed that could come from the fall out of this ruler and official, father and son. From another perspective, this meant that even though Fan Xian no longer had an official position, the Qing people in the court and marketplace still thought that if he truly threw caution to the wind, he would cause a certain degree of harm to the Qing kingdom. In just 9 days, The Cold War between the Emperor and Fanxian had come to an end. It was truly something worth celebrating. In the eyes of Wu the scholar and the others, there was no problem that could not be resolved between this pair of ruler and official, father and son. It was nothing more than intense emotions that forced out the ruthlessness and stubbornness in the father and son's hearts. No one was willing to give in first. Now, the emperor had taken the first step. It meant that the palace had taken a step back. Presumably, Fanxian had to accept this favor. In the cold air, Fanxian silently followed Eunuch Yao forward. Eunuch Yao, who was already the head eunuch in the palace, still played the humble role in front of him. However, Fanxian did not have much interest in talking. A teacher of the Imperial College? Although Fanxian was now a commoner, and the only thing that could be called a public official was this title, it was still piercing to the ears. Amidst these urging, Fanxian arrived at the royal study. With some surprise, he saw Hong Zhu waiting outside the study. Fanxian did not hide his surprise and nodded slightly. Hong Zhu bowed deeply. No one could see the exchange in the eyes between the two of them. Entering the study and seeing his sister, Fanxian's mood calmed slightly. He then bowed deeply toward the man on the soft couch but stubbornly did not say a word. That day, Fanxian had ridden back to Jingdo alone. Until he carried Chun Pingping's body and left the execution field, he had been reluctant to cast a glance at the man on the palace walls. Thinking carefully, it had been many months since he and the emperor had seen each other. The emperor looked at Fanxian calmly. He was not surprised by the emotions Fanxian revealed. He did not allow his officials to have any rebellious emotions in front of him. This did not mean he could not accept his favorite son revealing his true nature or stubbornness in front of him. The silence in the royal study did not last for long. Fan Ruo bowed slightly toward the emperor and smiled at her brother before leaving the royal study. She had stayed because the emperor wanted Fanxian to be at ease. Since this goal had been achieved, she also had to leave this ruler and official a quiet environment to talk. I have long wondered why I have been so lenient toward you. The emperor looked at Fanxian and slowly said. Naturally, it is not because of the contributions you once made to the Qin court. It was not until yesterday that I finally understood. The emperor looked at him and calmly said, I think there is no need for too much nonsense between us. There are some files here that you can take a look. In this story, it had been repeated countless times. The Qing emperor and Fanxian were the two most talented actors in the world. However, in the royal study, the Qing emperor did not act. He only said these words straightforwardly. The words were very simple, but Fanxian understood the meaning hidden within. He knew that what was placed on the file in front of him was evidence that Chun Pingping had once presided over his murder, such as the Hanging Temple, the Valley, and everything related to the separation. According to the dead old man's plan, Fanxian should act shocked and sorrowful and then return to the emperor's side. For some reason, seeing the emperor's confident, calm, and elegant expression, he felt a boundless anger. The anger made his heart ache and ache. He did not want to continue acting. Fanxian raised his head and looked straight at the man he was most familiar with and most unfamiliar to him. He did not move for a long time. Chapter 717. He took a deep breath. It was not yet late autumn, but in the imperial study, a dark-colored heater had already begun to emit warmth. The air was a little dry, and it went straight from his mouth and nose to his lungs, causing him to feel a faint pain. Fanxian looked at the emperor's face in front of him and suddenly thought of many things and people. The storm in the Qing kingdom began decades ago. As the dust gradually settled, the only ones still in the eye of the storm were probably this father and son pair. Fanxian's attitude toward the emperor was actually very difficult to grasp. Even he could not clearly explain it. From Danzhou to Jingdo, brushing shoulders in the Qing temple, meeting for the first time in the bamboo tea shop beside Taiping courtyard, from bestowing marriage to the Overwatch Council, and learning of the portrait in the palace, Fanxian had guessed earlier than anyone else. He had guessed his true past. Whether it was the Fan Shun of his previous life or the Fanxian of this one, They were both fatherless and motherless. Unfortunately, they were born in the kingdom of Qing, so they had a mother named Yi Qingmei. Later, they discovered that they had a father. But this was a bloodline inheritance. For Fanxian to truly regard this emperor as his father was something he could not have done at the time. At that time, Fanxian had been acting the entire time. He had acted beautifully. No one knew that there was a completely different soul inside him, so he could fool everyone, even the emperor in front of him. As time slowly progressed, Fanxian gradually began to have suspicions about the murder case in Taiping Courtyard. He became a bit more wary and even afraid of the emperor on the dragon chair. Thus, his acting became more steady and cautious. But after all these years, if Yi Qingmei and Fanxian were that connected soul hidden in history, an existence with a natural sense of closeness, a person who used the aura of everything around her to remind herself and gradually became one with her mother's image. The emperor had used so many years of interaction, favor, trust, methods, and realm to get closer to Fanxian's life step by step, making him feel indecisive. It had to be said that the emperor had invested in Fanxian a trust and tolerance that he had rarely shown in his life. At the beginning of the battle for the throne, perhaps the emperor had only watched his illegitimate son gradually grow stronger and, to a greater extent, used him. Gradually, the emperor's attitude toward Fanxian changed, particularly after the Jingdo Rebellion in the 7th year of the Qing calendar. For Fanxian to be able to have his present position and power in the Qing court and people, it had to be said that the emperor's favor toward him had far surpassed what he had toward the crown prince or the second prince. This pair of ruler and official, father and son, often discussed matters in the palace and chatted in the royal study. Fanxian hid something, so he continued to act. While acting, he could clearly feel what exactly the emperor's attitude toward him was. Thus, during these 3 years after learning the truth about Taiping Courtyard, Fanxian had been suffering with difficulty. Although he had been preparing in certain areas, he had never been able to truly settle his heart. On one hand, he knew that his majesty was like the great snowy mountain in his dreams. It was impossible for him to be easily overturned. On the other hand, he often asked himself late at night, what kind of light would come out of the crevice he was in? How should he choose? He wanted to choose a third path that did not necessarily lead to bloodshed. Thus, he had worked hard to be the vanguard of the king and the Qing court. He worked busily, completely against his nature. He only hoped that any matter could have a relatively calm and bright ending. He wanted Chen Pingping and his father to be able to retire peacefully. In the end, all of this was an illusion. Fanxian was disappointed, even hopeless. He felt sad and tired. He didn't want to act anymore. After carefully reading the files on the table, Fanxian gently coughed. Thinking about it, that deep breath earlier and forcefully suppressing the emotions in his heart had already caused some pain in his unhealed lungs to once again reappear in some part of them. The emperor looked at him silently and also gently coughed. There was an acknowledgement of each other's strength between this strange pair of father and son, as well as complicated emotions. Even their injuries were put together to tell the two of them that they were actually very similar people. According to Chen Pingping's plan, perhaps at this moment, Fanxian should show an expression of disbelief, tremble all over, be angry and confused, and then roar at the emperor, "I don't believe it. I don't believe this was done by the old director. Why would he do this?" Then the emperor would gently and coldly explain to him what kind of gold Chen Pingping had lived for the last few decades of his life, what kind of bone-deep hatred he had for the Li royal family, and how good this old dog had been to you in the past was actually all fake. He wanted the Qing kingdom to be destroyed in turmoil and destroyed in the disaster caused by our falling out as father and son. Then, Fanxian would still appear to be in disbelief. He would even angrily berate the emperor. "You faked all of this. Chen Pingping is not like that." Then, he would angrily leave the royal study and return to his manor. He would think for many days and truly understand the emperor's painstaking efforts, Chen Pingping's insidiousness, and so on and so forth. This was a proper core drama. This was the great turning point that the dramatist needed. The emotional conflict, in the end, yielded to the mutual trust between the emperor and his officials because of the ironclad truth. From then on, father and son would let go of their former enmity. The curtains would open, and the musical instruments would ring out. The glorious Qing kingdom would step onto the stage of history. However, Fan Xian did not have any expression. Fan Xian didn't have any expression. He just placed the files back on the table. He lowered his head slightly and didn't say a word. It was as if he was thinking about something important. It was also as if he was just too tired. Tired to the point that entering the palace had used up all of his energy. The emperor looked at him calmly. His eyes gradually narrowed at a very slow speed. His eyes gradually brightened and then dimmed. Disappointment rose and then turned to a kind of calm or coldness. So you knew all of this the entire time. The emperor looked at his favorite illegitimate child and coldly said, "I have always found it strange. The shadow has always followed you. This kind of thing shouldn't have been hidden from you. You should have long known that the Hanging Temple incident was done by that old dog. I have also been thinking, if you truly continue acting according to the things presented in these files, once I ask why Chan Pingping betrayed me, I really don't know how to open my mouth." The tip of Fan Xian's finger trembled slightly. He acutely sensed that a great change had occurred in the emperor's state of mind. However, his expression did not change at all. He raised his head and looked directly at the emperor. In a slightly raspy voice, he said, "I actually always knew." The emperor narrowed his eyes and looked at him. A cold light flashed and disappeared in his eyes. Fan Xian pressed his slightly dry lips together and did his best to suppress the rising and falling emotions in his heart. Calmly, he said, "Furthermore, I have always worked hard. I have worked hard to not let the blood of the past swallow up the things that already exist. From the moment I made this decision, I knew it was a very naive and childish choice. However, after my battle to the death with Yin Xiaoi 3 years ago, I understood that in one's life, one has to work hard to do something. Even if others laugh at my naivety, I have to silently try. Of course, naive things are always easy to fail. However, he looked at the emperor and said, any great thing, at the very beginning, doesn't it always seem particularly idealistic and naive to the point of ridicule? For example, the vow you, mother, and the others made by the seaside in Danzhou." The emperor continued to look at him silently. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. From the moment Fan Xian opened his mouth to say that he knew and worked hard, he knew clearly what kind of goal his favorite son had wanted to achieve all these years. For some reason, the emperor, who was already used to coldness, suddenly felt a glimmer of warmth in his heart. Perhaps it was not a bad thing. However, this glimmer of warmth often disappeared too quickly. He has already left. He no longer thinks about the past. "Why did you?" Fan Xian looked at the emperor woodenly and said in a raspy voice, "Why did you have to have him die?" These words were directed at Chen Pingping. Fan Xian did not cry out or angrily berate. He was only filled with sorrow and helplessness, as well as undisguised hatred. He looked woodenly into the emperor's eyes. The emperor also looked at him calmly. After a long silence, the emperor smiled. His smile was cold, disappointed, and sharp. "Huh?" The emperor narrowed his eyes and said, "I killed him." The emperor slammed his palm down on the table beside him. He didn't smash the wooden table into pieces, but the force was enough to send the paper on the table flying. He looked at Fan Xian and scolded in a low voice with slight anger. "What I am most angry about is this. I gave him a way out. If he hadn't come back from Dazhou, perhaps I would have pretended nothing had happened. However, in the end, he came back alone. He forced me to kill him." The emperor's gaze was as cold as a snowy mountain. "I could only do as he wished. I have stood in this world for dozens of years, and I have never trusted anyone easily, but I once trusted him. I even thought that maybe I could see him as a friend, and I even gave him a chance in the end, but he didn't give me any chance." The emperor took a deep breath. His calm voice was filled with a heart-shaking coldness. In the end, a servant will always be a servant. Hearing the word servant in these words, as well as the hatred and disdain that could not be hidden, The image of the old cripple in the black wheelchair seemed to suddenly appear in front of Fan Xian's eyes. He stared at the emperor. His voice was as sharp and cold as a knife. Gritting his teeth, he said, "The mistakes of the world are all the fault of others. Of course, your majesty is wise and powerful. However, I still don't know how my pitiful mother died." The emperor's face was cold. He had no reaction at all to Fan Xian's heart-wrenching words. He only narrowed his eyes and looked at him disdainfully. Including that old dog, all of the enemies of the Qing kingdom probably hoped for the scene in the royal study to happen today. You didn't disappoint them. You only disappointed me. Someone as stupid as you cannot be taught. Fan Xian closed his eyes and then opened them. They had already recovered their calm. However, there are many things that I still don't understand. If you don't understand something, then don't think about it. The emperor's tone was indifferent. It was clear that he was disappointed in Fan Xian's behavior. As for his last question about the cause of Yi Qingmei's death, it was unconsciously suppressed by the emperor in the depths of his sea of consciousness, not allowing it to surface. He looked at Fan Xian and coldly said, "In front of me, in the end, you are still an official. If you think too much, I will not let you continue to think." This was not a threat. It was just a simple statement of fact. It was just like the eldest princess's evaluation of Fan Xian. Fan Xian appeared to be naturally cold and unfeeling. In reality, he was very emotional and had too many weaknesses to grab. However, during the Jingdo rebellion, the eldest princess's wish had already been fulfilled. She did not deign to grab Fan Xian's weaknesses. However, in Jingdo, it was not a difficult matter for the emperor to crush Fan Xian to death. Hearing these cold and harsh words, Fan Xian straightened his body. Using a direct attitude that he had never shown in front of the emperor, he said, "Your Majesty has treated me very well these years. I know very well, inside the royal study, the father and son were not acting. They were both saying what they wanted to say the most." For the first time, Fan Xian stood up firmly and slowly spoke of his interactions with the emperor these years, one by one. When he got to the point where he spoke seriously, the heater in the royal study seemed to sigh. The smoke twisted as if it couldn't bear to see the father and son break apart. Only Fan Xian knew how well the Qing emperor had treated Fan Xian. If it had been the crown prince, the second prince, or any other son of the Li family standing in front of the Qing emperor and saying these words, they would probably have died a long time ago. However, Fan Xian was still alive. Perhaps the Qing emperor was a heartless person and did not treat Fan Xian with much affection. Relatively speaking, he gave Fan Xian the most affection. Listening to Fan Xian's calm recollection, the emperor gradually straightened his body. He then waved his hand tiredly and said, "I am not killing you not because I can't bear to kill you." The emperor closed his eyes and was silent for a moment. He then said, "I don't want to explain what happened in the past in front of a junior like you, but I think that perhaps those people have always been watching me from above. You are my and your mother's son. Perhaps you're like a pair of eyes they have left in this world. I won't kill you because I want to prove to you, as well as those who care about you, that I am right." He opened his eyes and coldly said, "And they're all wrong." Fan Xian bowed deeply and replied, "I will stay in Jingdo obediently and watch your majesty's great plans." He did not thank the emperor for not killing him because there was no need for thanks. Since the emperor allowed him to live, he would live on well. He would keep his eyes open and watch on behalf of Yi Qingmei, Chun Pingping, and many people in the past. "You will be obedient?" The emperor looked at his son and suddenly laughed. His laughter suddenly stopped. Icily, he said, "I don't believe it, and you won't believe it. However, I have never thought that your dishonesty is a flaw. I just hope that you won't be so dishonest that I can't be bothered to tolerate it. Just stay in Jingdo." The emperor glanced at him and suddenly said tiredly, "Just teaching in the Imperial College is good. Don't touch the matters of the Overwatch Council and the Palace Treasury anymore. I don't want to spend too much time on you." Having spoken to this point, it cannot be said any more clearly. The emperor was giving Fan Xian one last chance to live if he was willing to be obedient. Even though this was a threat to his life, for some reason, a glimmer of confusion grew in Fan Xian's heart. He had not thought that the emperor would make such a decision in the end. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's complicated gaze. Suddenly, his heart darkened. He thought of how Fan Xian had blurted out "father" by the seaside in Danzhou. After a moment of silence, he said, "In the future, if you have nothing to do, you can still come into the palace to pay your respects. When you are alone, I allow you to call me father." There was no one else in the royal study. It was completely silent. Fan Xian's body froze slightly. "Seriously," he replied, "Yes, your majesty." No one knew what the emperor and Fan Xian talked about in the royal study. At least, when Fan Xian walked out of the royal study, his body was unharmed and had not become a spirit. This reality made most people in the royal palace let out a breath. The emperor had also issued an edict for Fan Xian to return to his position. There weren't even any obscure hints of rewards. On the contrary, at almost the same time Fan Xian walked out of the royal study, a few edicts that had been prepared beforehand were sent out. The court, with the cooperation of the 6 ministries and 3 temples, began to strengthen the purge of the Overwatch Council and Palace Treasury. The edicts summoning Suzhou, Zhizhou, Changjialan, Jiaozhou Judge Ho Jichang, and the Palace Treasury Transport Company Su Wan Mao to the capital to report on their work had also been sent out. At the same time, the edict naming Yin Bingyun the director of the Overwatch Council left the palace one step ahead of the others. It was clear that the internal court had long made preparations. The emperor saw through his son, Fan Xian, too well. Even if he didn't want to kill him, he had enough ways to trap Fan Xian in Jingdou, so he wouldn't move rashly and be too dishonest. As for whether or not the information Fan Xian had sent out through the Qinian unit could, in the end, become a bargaining chip with the emperor, it would depend on whether or not the emperor had this kind of sensitivity and powerful motivation beforehand. In reality, regarding these 2 points, there was probably no one in this world who was stronger than the emperor. Fan Xian walked out of the palace with a heavy face. Hongzhu, who saw him out, was careful and followed at his side with slight fear. Chapter 718. The Fan Manor's carriage traveled on the road out of the city. It had just passed the West City Gate and was headed toward the country estate in the distance, shrouded in twilight. He entered the palace in the morning and only returned to the manor in the afternoon. Fan Xian did not tarry. He boarded the carriage with Wan and went to the country estate on the outskirts. Last night, an edict from the palace had come out. The surveillance of the Fan Manor had completely ended. People had thought that the Cold War between the emperor and Fan Xian had ended. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian entered the palace to see the emperor, there was no news of his return from the palace. There wasn't even a related edict. Putting aside what the officials in court and the various powers were guessing, the fact that the Fan Manor's carriage had left just like that still shocked many people. What surprised many people was that the Fan Manor's carriage had smoothly passed through the Jingdou City Guard's inspection. More accurately, it had not been inspected at all. Was the emperor not worried that Sir Fan Jr. would leave Jingdou in a fit of anger? Although the emperor's household did not have children running away in anger, the scene on the execution field, as well as the disputes these days, made people scratch their heads in confusion about Fan Xian's response. Many people were worried whether or not Fan Xian would leave Jingdou. It was clear that the emperor was not worried. Otherwise, he would not have removed all the surveillance outside the Fan Manor, or given Fan Xian such freedom. My sister is in the palace, and the emperor's edict has been sent out. The subordinates and relatives who rely on me to live are all in Jingdou. How can I leave? Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at the autumn scene illuminated by the red twilight outside Jingdou. In a quiet voice, he said, "Bring back Xiaohua and Liangzi. Let's live well in the manor." Lin Wan'er's heart trembled slightly. She didn't know if Fan Xian's words came from the bottom of his heart or if they contained some other meaning. If staying in the Fan Manor and being an idle person was the emperor's edict, then Lin Wan'er knew why Fan Xian was forced to accept this edict. The Fan Manor had received a bad piece of news when it opened. That day, Lin Wan'er had immediately made a decision to have Tang Zijing send the young mistress and young master to the Fan Manor outside the city. She was worried that something would happen later and was prepared to quietly send the children back to Danzhou. However, the manor had just sent news that the carriages sending the children had arrived at the manor and could no longer leave. It was not that there was an army waiting there. Rather, a eunuch was already waiting. Under these circumstances, Tang Zijing did not dare to act rashly. If he truly secretly sent the young master and mistress back to Danzhou, who knew if something would happen on the way? Would the court shed all pretenses of cordiality and snatch these two children into the palace? Fan will be the same with Fan Roro. Fan Xian's brows furrowed slightly. In the end, I still underestimated the meticulousness of the emperor's thoughts. Now that I think about it, the day you decided to send the children back to Danzhou, something had just happened in the royal study. Qin Pingping had just been sent to the Overwatch Council. At that time, the emperor was heavily injured, but he still did not forget about her children. My arrangements were not thorough. At the time, we shouldn't have waited in the manor. We should have thought of a way to send them directly to Danzhou. A glimmer of darkness flashed through Lin Wan-er's brows. She had not thought that her uncle the emperor would be so cold and severe that he wouldn't even let go of two children. At that time, you could only contact the first bureau. My people were scattered outside Jingdou. If you wanted to send them to Danzhou, there was no way. Fan Xian gently put his arm around her thin shoulders and comforted her. You've been tired enough these days and worried enough. This has nothing to do with you. Our emperor even dares to use the temple, much less two children. Fan Xian gently put his arm around her thin shoulders and comforted. You've been tired enough these days and worried enough. This has nothing to do with you. Our emperor even dares to use the temple, much less two children. What exactly did you and Chengping talk about in the palace? What exactly did you and Chengping talk about in the palace? Lin Wan-er sighed and thought to herself. The entire family was trapped in Jingdou. The emperor did not reveal much of his extraordinary face. Only this faint threat was enough to make Fan Xian and her not dare to act rashly. Thus, she changed the topic and continued to ask the previous question. She also knew about the matter of the concubines. As intelligent as she was, she guessed the emperor's intentions. Thus, she wanted to hear some of Shufang Palace's reaction from Fan Xian. What can I say? Fan Xian smiled faintly. Hongzhu, that little eunuch, has been by my side the entire time. He has the emperor's edict to send me out of the palace. Can Chengping and I kick him aside? There was an ambush in these words. For the sake of Hongzhu's safety, Fan Xian had kept this secret tightly. Even the third prince did not know the true relationship between him and Hongzhu. Earlier in Shufang Palace, the third prince had been somewhat rude to Hongzhu. However, there is no need to worry too much. After all, Chengping has performed very well these years. How could the emperor bear to have the court fall into chaos again because of my relationship? Fan Xian's brows twitched. In front of Hongzhu, I gave the third prince a good scolding. In any case, it will probably be very difficult for me to enter the palace in the future. I should quickly scold him. It would be best if I can make Chengping truly angry at me. The carriage moved gently along the road. In the distance, the setting sun in the western sky dragged out a long red tail. It brushed across the nearby hills, and then the faintly discernible head of Tsang Mountain in the distance. Who can this fool? Lin Wan-er leaned into his embrace. She felt her heart was unusually heavy. Putting on a show for Hongzhu to see. Will the emperor believe it? Regardless of whether the emperor believes it or not, I will not see Chengping in the future. We will also have to cut off contact in Duke's Alley. It would be best if you don't enter the palace as often. Fan Xian gently stroked her face. After a moment of silence, he said, It's best if we don't drag other people into our own matters. Lin Wan-er straightened her body and looked at him calmly. What do you want the emperor to believe? To believe that Chengping does not have true affection for you? Don't forget that Big Brother is still in Dongi. Each day, he doesn't bring you and your brothers into the palace. The emperor will not be at ease. Isn't the matter of the consort selection clear? Correct. It is separation. Fan Xian looked at his wife and said seriously. Fan Xian gazed at his wife and said seriously, "This is a true separation. Even if something happens to me, don't drag Qingping into it. Chen Pingping did this in the past. I also wanted to do this. However, I don't have much foresight, so I prepared much later." Lin Wanner sighed helplessly and said, "Based on what you say, the emperor still intends for Qingping to succeed. Then, why is there a consort selection? Just in case. This kind of thing is easy to understand," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "It's only a 10-month pregnancy. How could it be so easy to have child? Those beauties are only 14 or 15 years old. If they want to be stepmothers, they will have to endure for a few more years." Speaking of this, Fan Xian sank into deep thought. He thought of the problem of the emperor's masculinity. If one carefully calculated the emperor's age, given his great grandmaster realm body, the matter between men and women should not be too difficult. However, he was getting older, so his desires would probably grow thinner. Concerning the aftereffects of the tyrannical martial secret, Fan Xian knew better than anyone else. Adding to the discussion he had with Siga Jian at the end in Dongyi, Fan Xian confirmed that the emperor's body no longer had normal meridians. Instead, it had become a completely unobstructed channel or vessel. Only this could allow the physical body to contain so much tyrannical Zhenqi. Only then could one point into Kuhi's body on Dong Mountain and force a great grandmaster to death. No matter how tyrannical it was still tyrannical. It only had the name of the way of the emperor. How could there be a true change? Fan Xian thought of this and raised his brows slightly. He had proven that the emperor's constitution was cold on the outside and dry on the inside. His breathing disturbed his nature. He would probably need to eat a few more Lengxiang pills. If he didn't have Lengxiang pills to eat, then eating more celery would be good. Garlic? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and thought about the Imperial Academy of Medicine's conclusion. He prayed to the heavens to ensure that a great grandmaster's body was no different from a mortal's body. Celery, garlic, and bean products, particularly the first one, had a powerful killing effect. Without question, only Fan Xian knew this knowledge. The Imperial Academy of Medicine did not know. Hong Zhu did not understand. Even the emperor did not know. Whether or not the tricks Fan Xian had done in secret would bear fruit in the future would depend on whether or not the heavens would help him. As long as the emperor had no more children, then the third prince's position would be as stable as Dong Mountain. This was Fan Xian's hope. Perhaps making the emperor have no more children sounded like a sinister plot. However, Fan Xian did not think so. The emperor already had 3 sons. That was enough. If he had more, it would just create more trouble for the Qing kingdom's future in the fight for the throne. At least he didn't make the Li family die without descendants. Thinking of this, Fan Xian thought of Chen Pingping and couldn't resist smiling. I still have the heart to offer my services, but I have no reason to see a wise ruler. Lin Wanner was slightly surprised to find that Fan Xian was making another poem. Thinking about it closely, she found that this poem only talked about the grievances of an official. She looked at Fan Xian in a daze and wondered if he was truly willing to forget the death by 1,000 cuts in front of the royal palace and the bloody case in Taiping courtyard decades ago. As for the emperor, Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, Fan Jian, and that group of old people, Fan Xian had already told her everything. Only now did Lin want to know that in the shadows of the royal palace and behind history, there were so many heartless choices and vengeance. Thus, she did not have the extravagant hope that Fan Xian would actually stay obediently in the manor. However, she heard these 2 lines of poetry. As she thought this, the carriage arrived at the Fan clan's country estate. The entire clan, young and old, had already received the news ahead of time. They waited obediently outside the country estate for the arrival of the young master and mistress. Although Fan Xian no longer had an official position, he was still the backbone of the Fan clan. Other than the vengeance, he still had to shoulder the people his father had entrusted to him. Dusk shone on the gates of the country. Cece was carrying Fan Liang. Shunning, who was wearing a large flowery farmer's clothing, was holding onto her leg. She looked curiously at her parents, who were getting off the carriage. She was already 3 years old and had no problem remembering people. Fan Xian accepted Fan Liang's embrace from Cici's hands and quietly said something by her ear. He then smiled and had the people waiting for him quickly disperse. He then pulled Shunning's small hand and walked into the central room. He asked, "Has Xiaohua been good lately?" When they reached the central room, the well-behaved Shunning let go of her father's hand and threw herself into Lin Wan'er's arms. Cici was busy making arrangements for the night's rest. Fan Xian turned his eyes and saw a eunuch in the central room. He nodded toward the eunuch. The eunuch's expression was very ugly. There was also a hint of fear on his face. He quickly went forward and kowtowed to Fan Xian before leaving the country estate. The eunuch's figure disappeared through the door. Only then did Teng Zijing walk out on his crutch and spit at the figure's back. "Pay attention to hygiene," Fan Xian said with a smile. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Teng Zijing had been heavily injured in order to protect him. One of his legs had been broken by an assassin. Although he had gotten much better after being nursed back to health, he often used a crutch at home. Teng Zijing looked at him and said with shame, "I was useless and was unable to send the young master and young mistress away." He then continued, "I had planned to kill that little eunuch, but I was afraid it would cause trouble for you. Don't look at him just because he's a little eunuch who doesn't know anything. He represents the emperor. How could you casually kill him?" Fan Xian said carelessly. He then touched the large flowery dress Shunning was wearing and said with a smile, "It's quite bright." The wife of the Teng family came out with hot tea. She smiled embarrassedly and replied, "It's third sister-in-law's daughters. It shouldn't have been worn by the young mistress," but Teng Zijing scratched his head and said, "These days, there's no way to get news from the manor. The elders in the clan discussed it with my family and thought it would not be difficult to hide it from that little eunuch. We were just worried that there might be an ambush from the court along the way. Thus, we planned to disguise the young mistress and young master as country children. If something happened, we would see if we could secretly send them away." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what the people in the clan were preparing to do. He then thought of the bloody case in Taiping Courtyard on Lujing River. Buruo's biological mother seemed to be like the wife of the Teng family in front of him. His face darkened, and he said, "In the future, don't think about such foolish things. How can you hide it from others? Don't harm other people's children for nothing." Seeing that Teng Zijing only made a casual sound of agreement and did not take it seriously, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and scolded, "The elders in the clan can be said to be foolish. How could you all be so foolish?" Fortunately, the Fan Manor had opened and Fan Xian had rushed over. Nothing had happened, so there was no need to say these things now. However, thinking of the clan members who had welcomed him at the entrance of the country estate earlier, even someone as cold as Fan Xian couldn't help but be moved. His heart was moved, but he sank into an even deeper worry. Traveling alone under heaven, he could happily repay kindness and hatred. Even if he spilled his blood and threw away his head, it was all in exchange for no regrets. Chun Pingping still wanted to send the girls in the garden to Donnie, but there were so many people around Fan Xian. How many could he send away? There was only one life in which to live without regrets. How could it be so easy? Their family did not stay long in the clan estate. After only one night, they picked up their children. The next day, the family of 5 left the manor to return to Jingdou. Just as the emperor had said in the royal study, and just as the eldest princess had said one day to her strategist, Fan Xian's weakness was too fatal. As long as he grasped this point, even if he grew wings, where could he escape to? Even if he could escape, would he want to? If he didn't escape, he could only face it. But the snowy mountains were so high and so cold. Holding a pair of children, Fan Xian sat in the carriage with a smile. His gaze occasionally looked through the window at the Tsang Mountains, reflecting the white light from the east in the morning. The Tsang Mountains were on the west side of Jingdou. They were far from the official road, but they were tall and majestic, piercing the clouds. It was only early autumn, so the top of the mountain had long been covered in snow, adding a touch of coolness to the world. Do you still remember those 2 years of winter in the Tsang Mountains? Fan Xian suddenly asked. After he said this, expressions of happiness and reminiscence appeared on Lin Wan and Cece's faces. The first year, Cece had been purposely left behind by Fan Xian in the old manor in Jingdou. The second year, she still went with him. For the young people of the Fan Manor, the snow in the Tsang Mountains could clear their hearts and wash their faces. It was a beautiful little world completely cut off from Jingdou. There, Fan Xian could fully reveal emotions that were different from this world. Regardless of whether it was playing mahjong or chatting, the warm Kong in the winter snow always brought back such memories. The carriage gradually became quiet. Lin Wan thought of Yiling, and Rojia, who occasionally went up the mountain. These days, the Fan Manor in Jingdou had been surrounded. Presumably, Yiling was also worried about King Jing's matter in the palace. "How is King Jing?" Lin Wan asked worriedly. "The emperor's anger has subsided. Naturally, he will be allowed to return to the manor. He didn't even punish me, much less him." Fan Xian shook his head. He thought of his brother, Xija. He didn't know if there would be any problems after he heard the news in the north with so many things happening in Jingdou. Sitting by Fan Xian's side, Shunning suddenly looked at the snow on the Tsang Mountains. Pursing her lips, she said in a childish voice, so high. It was very high. It would be difficult to go up. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and gazed at the top of the Tsang Mountains. He took a deep breath. On that snowy mountain were his most beautiful memories in the Qin Kingdom. There was also the time when Uncle Wu Zhu took him to climb the mountain and lie in the snow. He knew how difficult it was to climb to the peak of that snowy mountain. His eyesight was startling. Suddenly, he saw a few eagles circling toward the highest peak of the Tsang Mountains. Unconsciously, he pointed to Shunning and said, "Look, if you can actually go up, it would actually be very beautiful." Chapter 719. Under Hong Zhu's lead, Fan Xian walked silently toward the outside of the royal palace. Along the way, the eunuchs and serving girls he saw all turned their bodies to greet him. Occasionally, a new person who had just entered the palace would not be able to react and would be taught a good lesson by a ranked elder. Fan Xian did not have the energy to pay attention to these things. He just walked blindly. The people in the palace looked at Hong Zhu in front of him and thought that the emperor had reinstated eunuch Hong Jr. It was probably to dirty Sir Fan Jr.'s eyes. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not speak harshly to Hong Zhu. On the contrary, he chatted calmly with him. Hong Zhu also maintained his humble appearance and appeared very harmonious. Sir Fan Jr. and eunuch Hong Jr. were not normal people. The people watching this scene all sighed in their hearts. Perhaps only such people, who could hide their true emotions so well, could ensure their own survival and future in the unpredictable changes of the Qin court and palace. In reality, the affairs of the world were strange. In everyone's eyes, the question and answer between Fan Xian and Hong Zhu on the way out of the palace was an act for everyone to see. No one thought that Fan Xian and Hong Zhu were actually talking. Their voices were low, and their expressions were natural. Each of them played their roles well, but the contents of what they said were not normal. The emperor seems to like those dishes these days. Hong Zhu lowered his head and said obediently. Hong Zhu lowered his head and obediently said, "The Imperial Academy of Medicine has examined them. They are all extremely good ingredients for strengthening one's constitution." Fan Xian's eyes looked straight ahead and did not look at Hong Zhu's face. He gently made a sound of acknowledgement. It was impossible to see the change in his expression. 3 years ago, the rebellion had just been quelled, and the effects of the matter had gradually disappeared. Hong Zhu was taken out of the cold palace. At first, he was helping out in the royal kitchen. He was a person who had once seen great things. Adding to that his own cleverness and Fan Xian's secret help, not only did his days pass by easily, but he also gradually gathered some power in his hands. Later, Hong Zhu followed eunuch Dai to work, but did not weaken his influence on the royal kitchen. What Hong Zhu said to Fan Xian at this moment was the little secret between the two of them. More accurately, it was Fan Xian's little secret. Even Hongzhu himself did not know why Sir Fan Jr. wanted to influence the food ingredients the royal kitchen sent to the emperor. Hongzhu was not worried that Fan Xian would poison the emperor. In the royal palace, this was not possible. Regardless of whether it was a chronic or acute poison, there would be specialized people to examine it. Additionally, with the food tasting segment, the possibility of poisoning had basically been eliminated. Furthermore, these ingredients that had been secretly influenced by Hongzhu to be added to the recipes also received great praise from the Imperial Academy of Medicine, particularly the celery from the south. Because of its cool nature and sweet taste, it had the effect of clearing away heat and eliminating irritability. As well as curing extreme heat and irritating thirst, it was recommended by the doctors of the Imperial Academy of Medicine to be placed on the emperor's daily dining table. Not being poisonous was the most basic requirement. Hongzhu didn't know if there were any problems with the emperor's body. However, seeing that the celery, which could cure baths, clear away heat, and eliminate irritability, was so highly valued by the Imperial Academy of Medicine, perhaps the emperor's body truly did have internal problems. Hongzhu lowered his head slightly and glanced at Fan Xian. He did not see his true emotions. He thought to himself, in the current situation, Sir Fan Jr. is still worried about the emperor's body. Is he really a loyal official and filial son? Unfortunately, Sir Fan Jr. was a sentimental person. It would probably be difficult for him to let go of Director Qin's death and obtain the emperor's happiness again. The road out of the palace from the royal study was not far. However, Fan Xian had already received an edict earlier to go to Shufang Palace to see Yi Guipin and the third prince. Thus, Hongzhu took him in the direction of the inner palace. The reason the emperor had such an edict was perhaps because, from now on, Fan Xian would truly become an idle person in Jingdou. It would be difficult for him to have another opportunity to enter the palace. Walking outside Shufang Palace, Fan Xian heard waves of young women's laughter coming from inside. His brows furrowed slightly. Why had the royal palace suddenly become so lively? He turned his head to look at Hongzhu and asked, "The madams and young ladies of the Duke's Alley are entering the palace to pay their respects today? Why are there so many people?" "They're the beauties waiting to be selected. Because they have to wait for the candidates sent up by the various provinces next month, these dozen beauties will have to stay in the palace for a bit longer. Guipin has probably summoned them today and will have to follow some rules," Hongzhu replied quietly. Fan Xian listened to this news with a startled expression. For a moment, he could not come back to his senses. These days, he had been under house arrest in the Fan Manor. Later, he had been busy with those secret plans and had not paid attention to the rumors about the consorts in Jingdou. It was not until now that he learned that the emperor was preparing to take a wife again. Just like Yi Guipin and the third prince, Fan Xian did not spend too much time before he sensed the hidden meaning behind the consorts. His brows furrowed. He knew that not only was he moving, but the emperor was also moving. Furthermore, if the emperor did not move, it would be fine. Once he moved, it would be a sword pointing at the future and giving him the strongest warning. There was a glimmer of confusion and apology in his heart. This apology was for the mother and son in Shufang Palace. In this world, there were not many people like the mother and son who truly trusted a powerful aide from outside the palace. This kind of trust was rare. Now, because of him, they were going to face an unpredictable danger. Fan Xian's heart was uneasy. Seeing Fan Xian stand silently in front of Shufang Palace, Hongzhu thought he was thinking that there were beauties inside and that it was not appropriate for him to enter to see the empress and the third prince. In a quiet voice, he asked, "It is my fault. How about you come back another day?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why wouldn't I come in? Not following the rules? I have never been a person who abides by the rules. The emperor has given me an edict, so I came to see. If I still don't come to see, who knows when the next opportunity to enter the palace will be." As he spoke, Fan Xian was already striding toward Shufang Palace. The two eunuchs guarding the palace door had come with the beauties. They did not know who Fan Xian was. Seeing a young man wearing a plain cotton robe charging into the palace, they couldn't help but jump in fright. Although they did not know Fan Xian to be able to stay in the palace, they were all clever people. They did not dare to stop him. One of them followed behind Fan Xian and lowered his voice to greet him. The other charged into Shufang Palace to inform the people inside. Once he entered Shufang Palace, he heard a wave of panicked shouts and the sound of clothes being adjusted. Most of them were curious gazes. Fan Xian had come too quickly. The eunuch did not have time to say anything, and the palace girls did not have time to prepare anything before he entered the palace. Suddenly, countless pairs of eyes focused on him. The atmosphere in the kingdom of Qing was relatively civilized. Although they were deep in the palace, and men and women had to be on guard, suddenly seeing a young man enter the palace, these girls only lowered their voices and exclaimed a few times. They were not so embarrassed that they wanted to die, nor were they so perverted as to cry out loud. Amidst the forcefully suppressed panic, Fan Xian smiled warmly and bowed seriously toward Yi Guipin in the middle. "Auntie, it is quite lively here today." However, Fan Xian had already formally broken off relations with the emperor in the royal study. Although the emperor still had a death grip on his weakness and he couldn't do anything, in terms of his personality, he no longer wanted to hide anything. He faintly revealed a carefree spirit of not caring about anything. Yi Guipin was the sister of Lady Lu. When Fan Xian first entered the palace, she had been very fond of this jade-like little boy. Now that Fan Xian had long grown up, their relationship had long been very close. In private, Yi Guipin always wanted Fan Xian to call her aunt. She had not expected that with so many people in the palace, Fan Xian would still call her like this. Yi Guipin smiled slightly and said, "How old are you to be so cheeky?" These words seemed unhappy, but they were actually a reminder and a question. Fan Xian looked at her and shook his head. He smiled. A glimmer of worry appeared at the corner of Yi Guipin's brows. Fan Xian's behavior today was too strange. It looked like, although the conversation in the royal study had not reached the worst result, it did not have any signs of getting better. Thinking of this, Yi Guipin's heart felt like a large stone was pressing down on it. It was heavy. She forced a smile and said, "Why did you want to enter the palace today?" Everyone in the palace knew Fan Xian's purpose for entering the palace. This was just a formality. Fan Xian explained a bit. At this time, Xinger had already moved an embroidered stool over. This former little serving girl had now become the most senior serving girl in Shufang Palace and had the most power to speak. Fan Xian looked at her delicate face and smiled. He even found a moment to chat casually. Only then did he seriously say to Yi Guipin, "Other than seeing the emperor also ordered me to see the third prince's homework." The worry between Yi Guipin's brows grew stronger and stronger. She thought to herself, is he here to say goodbye? However, the young lady of the Fan family was in the palace, and there were hundreds of people in the Fan Manor and the Duke's Manor. Would Fan Xian actually dare to leave? For a moment, she couldn't help but have many things she wanted to ask Fan Xian. However, the beauties present were all looking curiously at this young man, so she couldn't ask. Yi Guipin's heart was very irritated. She wanted to chase all of these teenage girls out of the palace. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew that this concubine had misunderstood. He smiled and said, "Where is the prince?" This was finding an excuse to leave. After all, he was sitting in a room full of the emperor's future concubine. She was like his little stepmother. Fan Xian only wanted to use this opportunity to see the hidden meaning of the concubine selection. He didn't want to stay here forever. "Pinger is in the back. You can go by yourself." Yi Guipin felt a headache coming on. She looked at him and shook her head. The serving girl Xinger gazed at Fan Xian and smiled. She led him to the back. Hong Zhu followed closely behind. In the eyes of the bystanders, this was the emperor ordering Hong Zhu to keep an eye on him. As Fan Xian walked into the back of the hall, the atmosphere immediately relaxed. From the moment he entered, the dozen beauties forced themselves to calm down after a slight panic. They wanted to display the bearing of a royal family in front of the concubine. However, looking at the young official's handsome face and confident bearing, how could these girls, who were only 14 or 15 and usually found it difficult to even step out of the front door, completely calmed down. What made them curious was how such a young man dressed like a commoner could walk freely in the tightly guarded royal palace. Listening to this person's conversation with Iguapin, any of the beauties with a bit of insight guessed that this person was Sir Fan Jr. Unable to stop it, his appearance, which had been so good that it did not seem mortal, immediately gained a bit more luster in the eyes of these beauties. Regardless of whether it was the bold or the shunning, directly or quietly, they all looked at Fan Xian a few more times. At this moment, Fan Xian had left. Finally, a brave girl from the Duke's Alley asked, "Concubine, is this Sir Fan Jr.?" With Iguapin's nod of confirmation, these beauties couldn't help but begin to discuss in whispers. After all, they were still young girls. They had been bored in the palace for a few days and had suddenly met the legendary Sir Fan Jr. It was no wonder they were so excited. They had even tossed the admonitions at home before they entered the palace and the warnings of the teaching nannies in the palace to the back of their minds. However, there were a few arrogant beauties who just sat calmly to the side. They had seen something strange from Fan Xian's attire. In addition, these beauties had always seen the young lady of the Fan Manor in the royal study as their greatest enemy. Thus, when they saw Fan Xian today, they were not moved. On the contrary, they felt a faint hostility. Things have already been said to this extent, yet the emperor still wants you to go to Shufang Palace. In a normal carriage, Lin Wan'er looked at the slightly tired Fan Xian beside her. Quietly, she said, "The matter of the consort selection has happened very suddenly. I think the emperor is just giving you a warning. He doesn't have anything against the third prince, so don't worry too much." When they were alone, Fan Xian always referred to the emperor as Old Emperor, while Lin Wan'er referred to the man who had held her growing up as Uncle Emperor. It was not considered disgraceful, but it was somewhat domestic. Today, Lin Wan'er had directly referred to him as Emperor. Fan Xian knew that his wife understood that his mood was very poor. It is also to warn the officials in court not to think that the future Qin kingdom will definitely be the third prince's. He smiled and said, "Although the emperor is old, his ambition is still there. I just don't know if his awe-inspiring spirit is still there." "What did you and Xingping talk about?" Lin Wan'er gently pulled back the curtain of the carriage and looked at the early autumn Jingdo Street scene outside. Chapter 720. The Fan Manor's carriage traveled on the road out of the city. It had just passed the West City Gate and was headed toward the country estate in the distance, shrouded in twilight. He entered the palace in the morning and only returned to the manor in the afternoon. Fan Xian did not tarry. He boarded the carriage with and went to the country estate on the outskirts. Last night, an edict from the palace had come out. The surveillance of the Fan Manor had completely ended. People had thought that the Cold War between the emperor and Fan Xian had ended. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian entered the palace to see the emperor, there was no news of his return from the palace. There wasn't even a related edict. Putting aside what the officials in court and the various powers were guessing, the fact that the Fan Manor's carriage had left just like that still shocked many people. What surprised many people was that the Fan Manor's carriage had smoothly passed through the Jingdo City Guard's inspection. More accurately, it had not been inspected at all. Was the emperor not worried that Sir Fan Jr. would leave Jingdo in a fit of anger? Although the emperor's household did not have children running away in anger, the scene on the execution field, as well as the disputes these days, made people scratch their heads in confusion about Fan Xian's response. Many people were worried whether or not Fan Xian would leave Jingdo. It was clear that the emperor was not worried. Otherwise, he would not have removed all the surveillance outside the Fan Manor or given Fan Xian such freedom. "My sister is in the palace, and the emperor's edict has been sent out. The subordinates and relatives who rely on me to live are all in Jingdo. How can I leave?" Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at the autumn scenery illuminated by the red twilight outside Jingdo. In a quiet voice, he said, "Bring back Xiaohua and Liangzi. Let's live well in the manor." Lin Wan'er's heart trembled slightly. She didn't know if Fan Xian's words came from the bottom of his heart or if they contained some other meaning. If staying in the Fan Manor and being an idle person was the Emperor's edict, then Lin Wan knew why Fan Xian was forced to accept this edict. The Fan Manor had received a bad piece of news when it opened. That day, Lin Wanner had made a decision at the first instant. She had Teng Zijing take the young mistress and the young master to the Fan Manor outside the city. She was worried that something would happen later and was prepared to quietly take the children back to Danzhou. However, the country estate had only sent news today. It turned out that the carriages taking the children had arrived at the country estate and could no longer leave. It was not that there were soldiers waiting there. Rather, a eunuch was already waiting. Under these circumstances, Teng Zijing did not dare to act rashly. If he truly secretly sent the young master and mistress back to Danzhou, who knew if something would happen on the way? Would the court shed all pretenses of cordiality and snatch these two children into the palace? Just like Fan Ruoruo, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and said, "In the end, I still underestimated the meticulousness of the Emperor's thoughts. Now that I think about it, the day you decided to send the children back to Danzhou, something had just happened in the royal study. Chen Pingping had just been sent to the Overwatch Council. At that time, the Emperor was heavily injured, but he still did not forget about our children." The glimmer of a cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. Truly, the Emperor's kindness is vast and mighty. As officials, we should thank him. It was my lack of thorough arrangements. Back then, we shouldn't have waited in the country estate. We should have thought of a way to send them directly to Danzhou. A glimmer of darkness flashed through Lin Wan-er's brows. She had not thought that her uncle the Emperor would be so cold and severe that he wouldn't even let go of two children. At that time, the most you could contact was the First Bureau. My people were all scattered outside Jingdou. If you wanted to send them to Danzhou, there was no way. Fan Xian gently put his arm around her thin shoulders and comforted her. You've been tired enough these days and worried enough. This has nothing to do with you. Our Emperor even dares to use the temple, much less two children. What exactly did you and Chengping talk about in the palace? Lin Wanner sighed and thought to herself that the entire family was trapped in Jingdou. The Emperor did not show much of his extraordinary face. Only this faint threat was enough to make Fan Xian and her not dare to act rashly. Thus, she changed the topic and continued to ask the previous question. She also knew about the matter of the concubines. As intelligent as she was, she guessed the Emperor's intentions. Thus, she wanted to hear some of Shufang Palace's reaction from Fan Xian. What can I say? Fan Xian smiled faintly and said, Hongzhu, that little eunuch has been by my side the entire time. He has the Emperor's edict to send me out of the palace. Can Chengping and I kick him aside? There was an ambush in these words. For the sake of Hongzhu's safety, Fan Xian had kept this secret tightly. Even the third prince did not know the true relationship between him and Hongzhu. Earlier in Shufang Palace, the third prince had indeed been rude to Hongzhu. However, there's no need to worry too much. After all, Chengping has performed very well these years. How could the Emperor bear to have the court fall into chaos again because of my relationship? Fan Xian's brows twitched. In front of Hongzhu, I gave the third prince a good scolding. In any case, it will probably be very difficult for me to enter the palace in the future. I should quickly scold him. It would be best if I can make Chengping truly angry at me. The carriage moved gently along the road. In the distance, the setting sun in the western sky dragged out a long red tail. It brushed across the nearby hills, and then the faintly discernible head of Tsang Mountain in the distance. Who do you think you can fool? Lin Wan leaned into his embrace. Her mood was unusually heavy. Putting on a show for Hongzhu to see. Will the Emperor believe it? Regardless of whether the Emperor believes it or not, I will not see Chengping in the future. We will also have to cut off contact in Duke's Alley. It will be best if you don't enter the palace as often. Fan Xian gently stroked her face. After a moment of silence, he said, It's best if we don't drag other people into our own matters. Lin Wanner straightened her body and looked at him calmly. What do you want the Emperor to believe? To believe that Chengping does not have true affection for you? Don't forget that Big Brother is still in Dongi. Each day he doesn't bring you and your brothers into the palace, the Emperor will not be at ease. Isn't the matter of the consort selection clear? Correct, it is a separation. Fan Xian gazed at his wife and said seriously, it is a true separation. Even if something happens to me, don't drag Qingping into it. Chen Pingping did this in the past. I also want to do this. However, I don't have much foresight, so I prepared much later. Lin Wanner sighed helplessly and said, based on what you say, the Emperor still intends for Qingping to inherit the throne. Then, why is there a consort selection? Just in case. This kind of thing is easy to understand. Fan Xian smiled slightly. It's only a 10-month pregnancy. How could it be so easy to have child? Those beauties are only 14 or 15 years old. If they want to be stepmothers, they will have to endure a bit longer. Speaking of this, Fan Xian sank into deep thought. He thought of the problem of the Emperor's masculinity. If one carefully calculated the Emperor's age, given his great Grandmaster realm body, the matter between men and women should not be too difficult. However, he was getting older, so his desires would probably grow thinner. Concerning the repercussions of the tyrannical martial secret, Fan Xian knew better than anyone. Adding to the discussion he had with Sigu Jian at the end in Dongi, Fan Xian confirmed that the Emperor's body no longer had normal meridians. Instead, it had become like a completely unobstructed channel or vessel. Only this could allow the physical body to contain so much tyrannical Jinqi. Only then could he use one finger to guide half a lake into Kuhi's body and forcefully fill a great grandmaster to death. No matter how tyrannical it was still tyrannical. It only had the name of the way of the Emperor. How could there be a true change? Fan Xian thought of this and raised his brows slightly. He had proven that the Emperor's constitution was cold on the outside and dry on the inside. His breathing disturbed his nature. He probably needed to eat a few more Lungxiang pills. If he didn't have Lungxiang pills to eat, then eating more celery would be good. Garlic? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and thought about the Imperial Academy of Medicine's conclusion. He prayed to the heavens to ensure that a great grandmaster's body was no different from a mortal's body. Celery, garlic, and bean products, particularly the first one, had a powerful killing effect. Without question, only Fan Xian knew this knowledge. The Imperial Academy of Medicine did not know. Hongzhu did not understand. Even the Emperor did not know. Whether or not the tricks Fan Xian did in secret would bear fruit in the future would depend on whether or not the heavens would help. As long as the Emperor did not have any more children, then the third prince's position would be as stable as Dong Mountain. This was Fan Xian's hope. Perhaps making the Emperor have no more children sounded like a sinister plot. However, Fan Xian did not think so. The Emperor already had 3 sons. That was enough. If he had more, it would just create more trouble for the Qing kingdom in the fight for the throne. At least, he did not make the Li family die without descendants. Thinking of this, Fan Xian thought of Chen Pingping and couldn't resist smiling. I still have the heart to offer, but have no reason to see a wise ruler. Lin Wanner was slightly surprised to find that Fan Xian was making another rare poem. Thinking about it closely, she found that this poem only talked about the grievances of an official. She looked at Fan Xian in a daze and wondered if he was truly willing to forget the death by 1,000 cuts in front of the royal palace and the bloody case in Taiping courtyard decades ago. As for the Emperor, Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, Fan Jian, and that group of old people, Fan Xian had already told Wanner everything. Only now did Lin want to know that in the shadows of the royal palace and behind history, there were so many heartless choices and vengeance. Thus, she did not have the extravagant hope that Fan Xian would actually obediently stay in the manor as an idle person. However, she heard these 2 lines of poetry. As she thought this, the carriage arrived at the Fan clan's country estate. The entire clan, young and old, had already received the news ahead of time. They waited obediently outside the country estate for the arrival of the young master and mistress. Although Fan Xian no longer had an official position, he was still the backbone of the Fan clan. Other than the vengeance, he still had to shoulder the people his father had entrusted to him. Dusk shone on the gates of the country. Cece was carrying Fan Liang. Shunning, who was wearing a large flowery farmer's clothing, was holding onto her leg. She looked curiously at her parents who were getting off the carriage. She was already 3 years old and had no problem remembering people. Fan Xian accepted Fan Liang's embrace from Cece's hands and quietly said something by her ear. He then smiled and had the people waiting for him quickly disperse. He then pulled Shunning's small hand and walked into the central room. He asked, "Has Xiaohua been good lately?" When they reached the central room, the well-behaved Shunning let go of her father's hand and threw herself into Lin Wan'er's arms. Cece was busy making arrangements for the night's rest. Fan Xian turned his eyes and saw a eunuch in the central room. He nodded toward the eunuch. The eunuch's expression was very ugly. There was also a hint of fear on his face. He quickly went forward and kowtowed to Fan Xian before leaving the country estate. The eunuch's figure disappeared through the door. Only then did Teng Zijing walk out on his crutch and spit at the figure's back. "Pay attention to hygiene," Fan Xian said with a smile. In the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Teng Zijing had been heavily injured in order to protect him. One of his legs had been broken by an assassin. Although he had gotten much better after being nursed back to health, he often used a crutch at home. Teng Zijing looked at him and said with shame, "I was useless and was unable to send the young master and young mistress away." He then continued, "I had planned to kill that little eunuch, but I was afraid it would cause trouble for you. Don't look at him just because he's a little eunuch who doesn't know anything. He represents the emperor. How could you casually kill him?" Fan Xian said carelessly. He then touched the large flowery dress Shunning was wearing and said with a smile, "It's quite bright." The wife of the Teng family came out with hot tea. She smiled embarrassedly and replied, "It's third sister-in-law's daughters. It shouldn't have been worn by the young mistress, but..." Teng Zijing scratched his head and said, "These days, there's no way to get news from the manor. The elders in the clan discussed it with my family and thought it would not be difficult to hide it from that little eunuch. They were just worried that there might be an ambush from the court along the way. Thus, they planned to disguise the young mistress and young master as country children. If something happened, we would see if we could secretly send them away." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what the people in the clan were preparing to do. He then thought of the bloody case in Taiping Courtyard on Lujing River. Guruo's biological mother seemed to be like the wife of the Teng family in front of him. His face darkened, and he said, "In the future, don't think about such foolish things. How can you hide it from others? Don't harm other people's children for nothing." Seeing that Teng Zijing only made a casual sound of agreement and did not take it seriously, Fan Xian sighed in his heart and scolded, "The elders in the clan can be said to be foolish. How could you all be so foolish?" Fortunately, the Fan Manor had opened and Fan Xian had rushed over. Nothing had happened, so there was no need to say these things now. However, thinking of the clan members who had welcomed him at the entrance of the country estate earlier, even someone as cold as Fan Xian couldn't help but be moved. His heart was moved, but he sank into an even deeper worry. Traveling alone under heaven, he could happily repay kindness and enmity. Even if he spilled his blood and threw away his head, it was all in exchange for no regrets. Chun Pingping still wanted to send the girls in the garden to Dongi, but there were so many people around Fan Xian. How many could he send away? There was only one life in which to have no regrets. It was not an easy matter. Their family did not stay long in the clan estate. After only one night, they picked up their children. The next day, the family of 5 left the manor to return to Jingdou. Just as the emperor had said in the royal study, and just as the eldest princess had said one day to her strategist, Fan Xian's weakness was too fatal. As long as he grasped this point, even if he grew wings, where could he escape to? Even if he could escape, would he want to? If he didn't escape, he could only face it. But the snowy mountains were so high and so cold. Holding a pair of children, Fan Xian sat in the carriage with a smile. His gaze occasionally looked through the window at the Tsang Mountains, reflecting the white light from the east in the morning. The Tsang Mountains were on the west side of Jingdou. They were far from the official road, but they were tall and majestic, piercing the clouds. It was only early autumn, so the top of the mountain had long been covered in snow, adding a touch of coolness to the world. Do you still remember those 2 years of winter in the Tsang Mountains? Fan Xian suddenly asked. After he said this, expressions of happiness and reminiscence appeared on Lin Wan and Cece's faces. The first year, Cece had been purposely left behind by Fan Xian in the old manor in Jingdou. The second year, she still went with him. For the young people of the Fan Manor, the snow in the Tsang Mountains could clear their hearts and wash their faces. It was a beautiful little world completely cut off from Jingdou. There, Fan Xian could fully reveal emotions that were different from this world. Regardless of whether it was playing mahjong or chatting, the warm Kong in the winter snow always brought back such memories. The carriage gradually grew quiet. Lin Wan thought of Yiling, and Rojia, who occasionally went up the mountain. These days, the Fan Manor in Jingdou had been surrounded. Presumably, Yiling was worried sick outside. Other than worrying about the Fan Manor, Rojia was probably also worried about King Jing's matter in the palace. How is King Jing? Lin Wan asked worriedly. The emperor's anger has subsided. Naturally, he will be allowed to return to the manor. He didn't even punish me, much less him. Fan Xian shook his head. He thought of his brother, Xija. He didn't know if there would be any problems after he heard the news in the north with so many things happening in Jingdou. Sitting by Fan Xian's side, Shunning suddenly looked at the snow on the Tsang Mountains. Pursing her lips, she said in a childish voice, so high. It was very high and difficult to go up. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and gazed at the top of the Tsang Mountains. He took a deep breath. On that snowy mountain were his most beautiful memories in the Qin Kingdom. There was also the time when Uncle Wu Zhu took him to climb the mountain and lie in the snow. He knew how difficult it was to climb to the peak of that snowy mountain. His eyesight was startling. Suddenly, he saw a few eagles circling around and doing their best to fly toward the highest peak of the Tsang Mountains. Unconsciously, he pointed to Shunning and said, "Look, if you can actually go up, it is actually very beautiful." Chapter 721. In the spring, if he planted a lot of corn, would he be able to harvest a lot in the autumn? Perhaps in the eyes of many people, sowing melons and getting melons, sowing beans, reaping what you sow, karma begets karma, hard work makes up for one's lack of talent, and it was best to fish for some reward. After Fan Xian came to Jingdou from Danzhou, he had worked his life out for the Qin court many times and brought a lot of good fortune to the people. Although he was not a righteous and benevolent person, he had, either automatically or consciously, planted a lot of good fortune. Unfortunately, by the autumn of the 10th year of the Qin calendar, no good fortune had come. All of his official positions had been taken away, and all of his power had been taken away. All of the family he cared about had become disguised hostages. He had become a commoner. He had become a wealthy man of leisure who could only listen to songs and wander around Baiwa brothel. No one dared to speak up for him, and no one dared to plead for him to His Majesty. All the officials and citizens just calmly watched the scene unfold. They even watched it calmly, showing kindness without asking for repayment. Did Fan Xian have this kind of mentality? No one knew. In people's eyes, Sir Fan Jr. No, the little duke. No, Fan Xian had perfectly played the role of a wealthy man of leisure since the autumn. All he did was stroll the streets and alleys of Jingdou, soak in Baiwa brothel, play with the children in the manor, gossip with the women in the family, and read the new novels published by Damba Bookstore. The Damba medical shop across the door from the bookstore was still open. The doctors of the Imperial Academy of Medicine were replacing Fan Ro in practicing medicine among the people. No one knew if this was the condition the icy woman in the palace had made to the emperor. In any case, the young lady of the Fan family remained deep in the palace. Fan Xian had no way of entering the palace to see her. He could only change his original idea and ask his wife to enter the palace many times to see. Just like this, a month passed peacefully. The Fan Manor was so quiet that it was almost forgotten by the people of Jingdo. Fan Xian was so silent that he was almost about to disappear in people's discussions. However, there was one place that could not forget Fan Xian. It was the Imperial College. Although the Emperor's edict had taken away all of Fan Xian's official positions, he had thrown him an empty position as a teacher of the Imperial College. About 20 days ago, perhaps because it was too boring to be a wealthy idler in the manor, Fan Xian finally fought his way out of the land of gentleness and began to attend classes at the Imperial College. The Imperial College, surrounded by ancient trees, was as quiet and secluded as usual. The news that Fan Xian was coming to the Imperial College to teach stirred up the students. In the open space in front of the Qingxin Pond, one could often see hundreds of people gathered together and listening with great interest. Fan Xian's habit was to give lectures to these students at the stone steps in front of the Qingxin pool. Because there were too many students who came to listen to his lectures, the Imperial College could not arrange for all of them. They could only listen to his mischievous suggestion and place the class between heaven and earth. Some people couldn't help but think that perhaps Fan Xian just wanted to use the endless autumn rain to be able to talk less. The content of the class was actually very simple. It was mainly about the collections of histories and classics that the great northern Qi scholar, Sir Zhuang Mohan, had used his entire life's work to compile. The Qing Imperial College had used a number of years of effort, and, with the great support of Damba Bookstore, had long sorted through that carriage of books. Fan Xian was also relatively familiar with these books. When he spoke of the illusions in them, he did not need to have stage fright. Of course, Fan Xian's lectures were different. Basically, each time, he arranged for a few teachers to speak frankly and with assurance in front of the Qingxin pool. In the end, he would personally take the stage and debate with the students below the steps. As for the contents of the debate, because it was a bit disrespectful, it did not spread outside the Imperial College. Although Fan Xian was nothing right now, at least in the Imperial College and in the hearts of these young students, he was still a very remarkable figure. At least, he was a person with some special privileges. Fan Xian lazily ended the day's classes and couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the red-faced and thick-necked students' unrelenting verbal attacks. Clapping his hands, he walked down the stone steps and said, "I told you a long time ago, I can basically only memorize the classics and classics. If you want me to say something profound and meaningful, I can't say it clearly. Although I understand the principle of sending troops with a good reason, how can there be such a thing as a righteous battle in this world? It's nothing more than an excuse. The Qing Kingdom's mighty army points its sword to the world. Naturally, it is for the sake of saving the people." The student brought a dozen friends and caught up to Fan Xian's butt. Very unconvinced, he said something. Today's topic touched on the period when the Wei Kingdom was founded. Using plain words, both sides were analyzing the problem of the righteousness of war. Yet, this problem was the one that Fan Xian could not explain clearly. He also believed that not many people in the world could explain it clearly. Fan Xian got into the carriage and left the Imperial College. He no longer paid attention to the students who were still angry and dissatisfied behind him. The carriage traveled for a while on the streets of Jingdo. It then escaped the liveliness of the Imperial College's silence and returned to the clear autumn scenery. He unconsciously pulled open the curtains and looked at the scenery outside with a smile. However, he could not hide the sliver of melancholy between his brows. He had been a wealthy and idle person for a month. This was only a superficial appearance. He just wanted to create an appearance for the court and the palace to see. In Fan Xian's heart, there had always been a fire that was the complete opposite of his outward calm and happiness. However, this fire had been suppressed very well by him. Furthermore, he was forced to suppress it because the situation at hand still did not give him any opportunity to take advantage of. After returning to Jingdo, Fan Xian had never returned to the Overwatch Council, particularly after he had completely exiled the members of the Qinian unit from the capital. Even contacting the First Bureau had become difficult. However, this did not mean that Fan Xian did not have other sources of information. He knew that in only a month, the Emperor had, with Yin Bingyun's valiant assistance, successfully suppressed most of the unstable elements in the Overwatch Council. The work of changing the blood was also progressing methodically. It was just a matter of when it would be completely cleaned out. The news from Jiangnan was also not very good. All of these signs were the source of Fan Xian's worry. He found that he had still underestimated the control and power of imperial power in a feudal society. Even the Overwatch Council that Chen Pingping and he had worked hard to run for decades was developing in a direction of submission under the coercion of imperial power. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The problem between him and the emperor appeared to be in the Overwatch Council, the palace treasury, and Jingdo. In reality, it was under the heavens. All of the Qing court officials, the wise people among the people, and even who the scholar in Yin Bingyun did not understand this. Thus, they did not understand why the emperor would deal with Fan Xian like this. He had taken away all of Fan Xian's official positions and power, yet allowed Fan Xian to live freely in Jingdo and still maintain a secret influence. Fan Xian's present state was neither dead nor alive. Only he and the emperor knew why this state was. If it was just to deal with Fan Xian alone, the emperor was much stronger than him. Without any effort, he could knock Fan Xian into the dust and then step on him so that he would never be able to rise again. The problem was that outside Jingdo and even outside the Qing kingdom's borders, Fan Xian's secret influence was terrifyingly powerful. Even with the emperor's confidence and pride, he could not underestimate this level of valiance. Thus, the emperor had Fan Xian stay in Jingdo, neither dead nor alive. Then he slowly and steadily whittled away at Fan Xian's influence outside Jingdo. At the same time, he had to cut off Fan Xian's invisible hands that stretched outside the country's borders. This was a process of quantitative change leading to qualitative change. If he did not eliminate Fan Xian's influence to the point where the Qing court could bear the risk, the emperor would not actually kill him. Even if Fan Xian died, if Dongyi and Shiliang truly fell into chaos, the emperor would not want to see this scene. If the emperor could perfectly control these problems, then what was so important about Fan Xian's life or death? The carriage arrived at Baiyue brothel with familiarity. Fan Xian got off the carriage and entered the building with his hands behind his back. He walked directly toward the courtyard by the lake in the back. He didn't even glance at the figure at the end of the street behind him. The person watching Fan Xian was an ascetic monk. No one knew how many ascetic monks were watching him in secret. The problem was that ascetic monks could not get close to women. Fan Xian entered Baiyue brothel, so they couldn't follow. Passing through the slightly cool lake surface and the breeze, Fan Xian walked into the courtyard that had been set aside for him. Looking at the increasingly charming and beautiful brothel owner in front of him, he smiled and said, "What new songs do you have to listen to today?" "Sure, Qing." Covered her mouth and smiled. "Young master doesn't write poetry anymore. Will there be any good songs for you to listen to?" It had already been a number of years since Fan Xian had searched the brothel. Yet this Shurqing woman did not show any signs of aging. Fan Xian looked at her with narrowed eyes and smiled. He didn't say anything more. In reality, there was no need for the spies of the internal court to keep an eye on him. Everyone in Jingdo knew that Sir Fan Jr. had long become a half-crippled rich man of leisure. His greatest pleasure was to come find the girls in Baiyue brothel. A rich man of leisure. Fan Xian truly lived up to this reputation. Although he had no official position or power, he still had money. No one knew exactly how much gold and silver was hidden in the Fan Manor. On the surface, the Baiyue brothel in the Fan Manor had long swallowed up most of the high-class brothels in the world with the strength of the Qing kingdom and the protection of the Overwatch Council these years. Under the rules and regulations Fan Xian had single-handedly made, Baiyue brothel had already opened all over the world. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it had already unified the brothel industry. Baiyue brothel's nominal owners and shopkeepers, Shi Chanli and Sang Wan, were still developing businesses in Dongyi. They had already extended their hands into northern Qi Shanjing. Everything was going smoothly. No matter where they were prominent figures. Of course, everyone knew that Fan Xian stood behind them. Fan Xian lay on the soft couch and contentedly accepted the two girls' massages. His eyes were closed, but his brain was spinning quickly. Valua brothel was, in the end, an industry. The court could not be too shameless about it. The palace also did not want to completely destroy the Fan Manor's reputation, so they had left Fan Xian such a comfortable place. What comforted him the most was that it was clear that the people of this era had, in the end, underestimated the usefulness of a brothel in terms of intelligence. A few years ago, Fan Xija and the third prince, these two brats, were lawless and out of control. They had created a business that had now become one of Fan Xian's trump cards. What excuse did the court use for Su Wenmao's dismissal? Fan Xian asked with slightly lowered eyes after the courtyard had quieted down. As Fan Xian's trusted aide and a court official, Su Wenmao could not leave his post without permission. He could only wait helplessly for the court to act. Not long ago, an edict had been sent directly to the 3 large workshops in Northmin to bring Su Wenmao back to the capital. This was originally a very secretive matter. Because of the existence of Valua brothel, Fan Xian knew about it earlier than most people in Jingdou. Because he had long been mentally prepared, Fan Xian was not shocked or angry. He only thought worriedly about whether the people the Qinian little group had sent to Northmin had been explained clearly to Su Wenmao. He believed that Su Wenmao, a cheerful second-in-command, would not stupidly oppose the court head-on. However, he was worried that time was too tight and Su Wenmao would not be able to arrange enough people in the palace treasury. The palace treasury was Fan Xian's second route. The palace treasury transport company had already been completely taken over by the emperor, but Fan Xian would not allow this route to be directly cut off by the palace. If it was to be cut, it had to be done by Fan Xian. Furthermore, once the knife was cut down, it would make the Qin court feel bone-deep pain. Thinking of this, he thought of the heavily guarded 10-family village to the north of Dongyi, the 3 large workshops, the royal palace, and the one in his mind. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. The hands in his sleeves slowly tightened into fists. In Shiliang Road, Deng Ziyu had successfully escaped from the court's secret net. However, no one knew where he was hiding. Since there was no news of Deng Ziyu's death in the intelligence reports, Fan Xian felt very comforted. However, the members of the 4th Bureau were now without a leader. He didn't know if they could withstand the pressure from the Overwatch Council in Jingdou. The order Hong Yiqing had received was to first go into the grasslands to find that person and then come back to contact the powers in Dingzhou and Qingzhou. He hoped that everything would be in time. Gong Dian has already arrived in Dingzhou, Shi said with her head lowered. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. He had indeed not thought that the emperor's reaction would be so fast. He had actually moved the commander of the imperial army directly to Dingzhou to hold down the fort. Although Li Hongcheng had led troops in Dingzhou for a number of years, his foundations were still shallow. Gong Dian was also an old member of the Dingzhou army. His experience and contributions were there. Hongcheng would probably not be able to withstand it and would be forced back to Jingdou. If he wanted to think of a way for Hongcheng to remain in Dingzhou and control a portion of the military power that belonged to him, then he had to make Shiliang fall into chaos first. Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly. He realized that everything had long left his control. He could only hope that the first group of people he sent to the grasslands would be able to quickly contact Hu Gu and have the Hu people on the grasslands go against the heavens and first launch an attack in this early winter. Things were too chaotic and complicated. How could Fan Xian truly be idle? He glanced at Shi Qing helplessly and asked, "How is the investigation of the Ministry of Works corruption case going?" Sir Yang. Shi Qing glanced at him worriedly. Yesterday, the case was decided. This afternoon, the Supreme Court will issue a clear verdict. Although she had once belonged to the second prince, under Fan Xian's coercion these years, she had long been unable to have second thoughts. Furthermore, as a woman from a brothel, she knew that the young man in front of her was faintly different from all the nobles in Jingdou. She wanted to be the second Sangwon, but not the second Yuan Ming. Thus, seeing Sir Fan Jr.'s right and left arms being torn off one by the court, she couldn't help but feel terrified and afraid. Fan Xian glanced at the light on the surface of the lake. He was silent for a moment and then said, "It's afternoon. I'll go get him." From the time the case of Yang Wanli, the vice minister of the River Department of the Ministry of Works, was reported to the time the case was handed from the Ministry of Justice to the Supreme Court had only taken a dozen days. This kind of efficiency was enough to make one sigh in admiration even in the history of the Qin Kingdom. Those who didn't know the inside story would probably think that the emperor's edict to clean up the bureaucracy had suddenly become real in the Qin Kingdom's 10 years. As for the true officials, when they saw this scene, they couldn't help but sigh and feel cold, because they all knew what kind of person Yang Wanli was. He was a capable and honest official who had endured for 2 whole years on the embankment of the Great River. Yang Wanli was one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. The silver that Sir Fan Jr. had privately raised had flowed like water through the river transport governor's yamen and into the riverbanks. It had all passed through his hands. If he had truly wanted to be greedy, it would not have been the few thousand liang of silver stated in the crime report. Instead of eating the fat meat, he was going to take the bribes from the Ministry of Works yamen. Furthermore, all of the officials knew that Yang Wanli's family was very strict and treated his subordinates very leniently. Putting aside the Overwatch Council's salary that was many times that of court officials, just the 3 officials who held positions in the Qin Kingdom were actually supported by the Fan Manor every year. A mere few thousand liang of silver was not a difficult matter. Everyone knew that the Fan Manor was the foremost god of wealth in the world. How could Yang Wanli be greedy? It was precisely because they knew this that the officials knew that Yang Wanli's trial was only the palace's idea. Under the single-handedly arranged by Scholar, he of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the trial proceeded quickly. Today, the Supreme Court was going to pass judgment. According to some insider information, if the Scholar had not taken pity on Yang Wanli's talent and forcefully interfered, Sir Yang's fate would probably have been even worse. Fan Xian stood alone in front of the door of the Supreme Court yamen, alone and waiting for the result of the judgment inside. The bailiffs outside the Supreme Court yamen had long recognized his identity and were frightened. They had long sent word to the people inside to know, but they could only stand trembling in front of Fan Xian. Fortunately, Fan Xian did not fly into a rage. He only waited silently for Yang Wanli to come out. The yamen closest to the Supreme Court was the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The little bastards of the First Bureau discovered that the director was here and couldn't resist standing outside the door of the yamen, forcefully suppressing their excitement as they watched this scene. The First Bureau was Fan Xian's old nest. Back then, the rectification had created a group of loyal subordinates. Otherwise, there would not have been a large group of First Bureau officials escorting him out of the city when he made a scene at the execution field that day. Although Mutai had long been kicked out of the Overwatch Council, these officials still saw Fan Xian as the director and refused to accept Yan Bingyan. However, the Qing law and the council were strict. These officials could only watch the lonely Fan Xian from a distance and give him moral support. Fan Xian did not turn his head to look at those children. He continued to look at the Supreme Court yamen. A comforting smile rose to his face. A mighty sound rang out from inside the yamen. Before long, the former litigation master of the Overwatch Council, Jingdo's richest mouth, Song Shuren, silently walked out of the Supreme Court yamen. There was no joy on his face. On the contrary, there was a hint of darkness. Ever since Fan Xian had been stripped of his position as the director of the Overwatch Council, Song Shuren, a non-staff member, did not want to stay in the Overwatch Council anymore. Instead, he had come directly to find Fan Xian. Fan Xian had not thought that this rich mouth would have such a grateful side. After feeling slightly surprised, he settled him down. Coincidentally, the court was beginning to clean up Fan Xian's people. For the sake of the court's face, they could not use the methods of special agents. Everything had to respect the Qing law. Thus, Fan Xian had sent him out. At least, he had to help his subordinates obtain a relatively fair ending. Looking at Song Shuren's expression, Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. Right now, I can't enter the yamen. That's why I'm asking you. We've all seen the case. There's no reason we can't win. We know that the court has arranged for witnesses and evidence, but there's nothing we can do. Song Shuren sighed and looked at Fan Xian. Didn't you also use this method to punish the Ming family in Jiangnan? Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. His voice was suppressed to a cold line. In a stern voice, he said, I don't expect to help Wan Li escape punishment. However, the victory I speak of, at least, I have to see him right now. 3 years in prison. Song Shuren said dejectedly. Working for Sir Fan Jr. was like going against the entire court on his own. No matter how he fought this case, he would lose. How can there be such a thing as a prisoner? Fan Xian angrily rebuked him. 3,000 taels of silver, at most 3,000 li. The law of the Qing kingdom clearly states that returning the stolen goods and returning the money can be considered a crime. How did you fight this lawsuit? Song Shuren wanted to say something, but stopped. He forced a smile and said, Naturally, the Qing law is written like this. Originally, returning the stolen money and discussing the crime had already been agreed upon yesterday. However, when Scholar came to see the trial today, he erased this clause and changed it to imprisonment. His own way. Hearing this familiar name, Fan Xian did not get angry. On the contrary, he smiled. After a moment of silence, he took out a banknote from his clothes. Restraining his expression, he calmly said, Go in again and give this banknote to the official of the Supreme Court. Ask him how exactly did he learn the Qing law. Do you want me to personally stand out and fight this lawsuit with him? Song Shuren accepted the banknote and looked at the 30,000 liang on it. After a moment of silence, he gritted his teeth, stamped his feet, and walked back up the yamen. He knew that Fan Xian had done this because he had been forced by the court into a corner. For the sake of Yang Wanli's life and death, Fan Xian could only stand out and sell his not-so-old face. It all depended on what the officials of the Supreme Court would think. No one knew what Song Shuren said after he went in. Before long, an official coughed gently and walked to the bottom of the stone steps. He said something by Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian did not reply. He only shook his head. The official's expression was helpless as he walked back. Finally, Song Shuren helped Yang Wanli out of the yamen of the Supreme Court. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. He could see that Yang Wanli had been tortured in the prison. A dark fire surged in his heart, but he took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed it. He called for a few servants to lift Yang Wanli into the carriage. Yang Wanli brushed past him. This teacher and student, who were very close in age, did not say anything. However, a glimmer of dissatisfaction flashed through Yang Wanli's eyes, as well as a glimmer of grief and anger. Fan Xian felt a chill. He knew what Yang Wanli was grieving and angry about. An official who wholeheartedly wanted to do something. Yet because of these trivial matters in the court and royal palace, he had to endure an injustice that he did not have. Not only would he lose his position and be tortured, but his reputation would also be tarnished. As a scholar, who could bear this? Just as Fan Xian was preparing to leave, the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, his own way, accompanied by a few officials, slowly walked out of the yamen of the Supreme Court. His own way looked at Fan Xian and was silent for a moment. He then said, Master Fan, you are very elegant. Fan Xian couldn't even be bothered to glance at him. This attitude made the officials by his own way's side angry. The situation in Jingdo was no longer what it was in the past. His own way was currently popular, but Fan Xian had long been a commoner. To not answer an official's question in front of him was against the rules. His own way did not have any emotional reaction. He asked, I'm very curious. What exactly did you say to that official earlier for the official of the Supreme Court to suddenly change his mind? This was something that Scholar he was very curious about. He often entered the palace and knew that the crack between the Emperor and Sir Fan Jr. could no longer be mended. Thus, when he looked at Fan Xian now, he was not as afraid as he had been in the past. He had come to the hearing by imperial edict. He had secretly done something to ensure that Yang Wanli, one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, would never have a chance to rise again. He had not expected that everything, which had gone according to plan, would suddenly change. It was clear that this young man was no longer favored by the Emperor and held no official position. Why had the officials of the Supreme Court been frightened back by his words? He Zhongwei thought hard but could not understand. He didn't know what kind of magic Fan Xian had to make these officials not even listen to the emperor's hints. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at him coldly. I said to that official, "Don't force me to act out." "You want to force me to act out?" Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at He Zhongwei's slightly dark face. Suddenly, he smiled slightly and said, "Actually, I also want to know. What can you do to me when I flatter an official of the court on the street?" After these words were said, the officials at He Zhongwei's side finally understood that Fan Xian's power did not just lie in official position and power. They took a step back in fright, but He Zhongwei continued to stand calmly in front of Fan Xian. He sighed, understanding the reason. He couldn't help but feel some regret. In terms of official position and power, he might be able to suppress him. However, in the face of ruthless and unreasonable killing, he would never be as arrogant as him. The Suzhou Zhizhou, Cheng Jialin, was accused of visiting a prostitute and invading the mausoleum. He has been asked to return to the capital to defend himself. In a few days, he will probably come back to the Supreme Court, He Zhongwei said warmly. It looks like even you, a wealthy and idle person in Jingdou, cannot truly be idle. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. Casually, he said, "You are the emperor's dog, so you have to run around everywhere." "I don't." Many years ago, Fan Xian had already slapped He Zhongwei in the face. Now, outside the yamen, he had coldly called He Zhongwei a dog on the street. It was like slapping him in the face again. After all, He Zhongwei was no longer the little imperial censor of the past. As the first-ranked official in court, he had his own face to consider. Furthermore, there were so many people watching. His slightly dark face gradually changed. In a cold voice, he said, "As an official, I am the emperor's dog. In my eyes, you are also the emperor's dog. Are you not?" Scholar He thought that these words were appropriate. Not only did he preserve his dignity, but he also blocked these words and made it difficult for Fan Xian to respond. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian smiled when he heard these words. "If I am a dog, then what is the emperor?" Fan Xian said with a cold smile as he looked at him mockingly. He then turned and climbed into the carriage. He Zhongwei's expression froze. He knew he had said the wrong thing. It was just like how he didn't understand how Fan Xian could influence the Supreme Court. No matter how he had been demoted, he was still the emperor's flesh and blood. On this point alone, the people of the world could not compare. A powerful sadness rose in He Zhongwei's heart. He felt that life was always so unfair. In Jingdou, Fan Xian could not be idle. When he met the emperor's combination of punches with great difficulty, he could only focus on blocking. He had no ability or method to counterattack. On the true battlefield between him and the emperor, a soul-stirring drama was playing out. These dramas had no audience and were not recorded in the annals of history, but they were truly playing out. Only in these places could Fan Xian have enough power to carry out the most decisive counterattack against the chess pieces the emperor had laid out. In Dingzhou and Shiliang Road, no one knew what kind of entanglement Li Hongsheng and Gong Dian, who had come to take over his position, were having. On the road from the Qing kingdom to Dongyi, the armies of the two sides were facing off. No one was willing to give way. The 3,000 soldiers of the Yanjing camp for winter training were forcefully blocked at the border, not daring to take a step in. This situation had been in a stalemate for 3 days. The emperor has an edict for us to enter Dongyi to assist the Great Prince in quelling the rebellion. In the end, the Great Prince has blocked it with a military order, saying that his 10,000 elite soldiers are enough. The commander of the Yanjing camp, Wang Zhikuan, looked at his trusted aides in the tent and smiled coldly. Since those 10,000 elite soldiers are quelling the rebellion in the Liang kingdom, who can stop our soldiers from entering Dongyi? When he said this, Wang Zhikuan's anger finally exploded. This was originally a test the court had sent toward Dongyi. Everything had been going according to plan. If the Great Prince had not sent troops to stop them, these 3,000 elite soldiers would have been the vanguard. The Yinjing camp had prepared 20,000 people to advance along the road. Who knew that these 3,000 elite soldiers would be blocked at the border and not be able to take a step in? He pointed at the generals below and scolded. 1,000. Are 1,000 people enough to scare you out of your wits? They are also soldiers of the Qin kingdom. Do they actually dare to attack the army sent by the court? Those are the Black Knights, the general said in a trembling voice. Chen Pingping is dead, and Sir Fan Jr. is under house arrest in Jingdou. Who knows if these Black Knights, who kill without batting an eye, will actually pull out their swords. The corners of Wang Zhikuan's eyes twitched slightly, but he didn't curse angrily. As for this secret military operation, he had nominally accepted the Bureau of Military Affairs winter training. In reality, he had accepted the emperor's secret edict from the palace. Just as he said earlier, this was a test. This was the emperor sitting on the throne, testing his eldest son far away in Dongyi. The news of the Jingdou incident had long reached Yinjing. Only now did Wang Zhikuan know that the duke had led the Black Knights straight into Jingdou to save old Director Chen. The commander of Yinjing didn't know why Director Chen had suddenly been purged by the emperor. Although he sighed slightly in his heart, as a soldier of the Qin kingdom, he had to obey the emperor's edict. Not long after the Jingdou incident, the Great Prince suddenly sent an urgent military report saying that volunteer armies were rising and falling within Dongyi. The chaos of war was frequent, and it was impossible for him to escape and return to the capital in a short time. This blocked any way for Jingdou to summon him back. Wang Zhikuan knew that the Great Prince didn't want to return to the capital. As the saying goes, when a general is outside, the ruler's orders cannot be obeyed. It was clear that the Great Prince, who had successfully controlled 10,000 elite soldiers, had already left the emperor's heart because of the Jingdou incident. Once the Great Prince's attitude was revealed, the emperor was not angry. Instead, he sent an edict to Dongyi, saying that he would send the Yinjing military into Dongyi to help the Great Prince quell the rebellion. Just as Wang Zhikuan expected, the Great Prince forcefully refused the Yinjing camp's request to send out troops. Furthermore, the group used to stop the Yinjing army these 2 days was indeed not the Great Prince's people. The court couldn't even find an excuse. The Black Knights. Wang Zhikuan furrowed his brows slightly. Thinking of this group of riders, which were not many but had exceptional battle power, he naturally thought of that idler in Jingdou. It's the last 2 days of 2008. I had wanted to write a separate chapter to canvas for votes and review, but I changed my mind and decided to leave it for when Qingyu was finished. A friend has said that the flavor of Qingyu has changed recently and is no longer sunny. I would like to explain this a little. Qingyu has actually not been sunny for a long time. With such a dead person, there is no sunlight. Ever since I started writing Qingyu, I have always had an opinion that Fanxian is not like a transmigrator. How should I explain this? I will leave this question for the last time, as it takes up too many words. Of course, if there are friends who have noticed this, presumably you will know that my attitude toward transmigrators has long been made clear. However, I have always been curious. What should a transmigrator be like? In reality, human nature really has not evolved. Modern people, ancient people, and other people, as long as they are people, they are all equally ugly and beautiful. I almost forgot again. I seriously recommend to everyone, Zhangyu, the Fat Tabby Cat's new work, Song of the Heavenly Sword. The book number is 112-1194. It is said that this author is a very gay and serious author. His writing speed is slow, but the quality is very good. From the day he wrote to the day he was reincarnated, presumably many friends like him. I am the same. This book is a wuxia novel. Those who write wuxia novels in this marketplace, without question, have invested far more in the battle of the spirit than in the battle of business. This kind of attitude has already ensured the quality of this book. I deeply believe this. Chapter 722. We have to go. Wang Zhikuan did not say these words. He only glanced coldly at the generals in the tent, and slapped the table. In a meaningful and heartfelt tone, he said, "I don't care who these Black Knights belong to. I only know that the Bureau of Military Affairs Winter Training Order says very clearly that no one can stop the 3,000 riders of the Yinjing camp entering Dongyi. The 3,000 Yinjing soldiers were just a test. They were the vanguard." It was the attitude the court was showing as it pressed toward the great prince step by step. Wang Zhikuan's eyes narrowed slightly as a cold light gradually rose in them. He squeezed his voice into an icy line. No matter what, the 10,000 soldiers the great prince leads are, in the end, people of the Qin kingdom. The great prince cannot take the risk of a mutiny and bring those soldiers to stop them. Thus, the problem at hand is the 1,000 Black Knights placed around Yodo Mountain. The day after tomorrow, we will send the Bureau of Military Affairs transfer order to them. If they are still not willing to give way, then it can only prove that they are no longer part of the Qin kingdom's army. But the emperor's attitude toward Sir Fan Jr. is still unclear, a general said worriedly. If the Yinjing camp actually fought with the Black Knights, it would be the same as officially shedding all pretense of cordiality with Fan Xian's faction. The atmosphere in Jingdo was very delicate. The generals in Yinjing did not know exactly how the person in the palace was planning to deal with Fan Xian. If they just wanted to give Fan Xian the cold shoulder, then the Yinjing camp's actions were too dark and heavy. In the future, it would be difficult to salvage the situation. The tent was deep in Yinjing. It was actually a very large room. However, it had a name with a strong military flavor. The generals in the room were all Wang Zhikuan's trusted subordinates, so there were many things they could say that were not taboo. Some things could be said openly. The worry the general spoke of earlier was actually the worry in Wang Zhikuan's heart. The emperor had indeed removed all of Fan Xian's official positions, but he had never truly questioned him. Who knew how the situation would develop in the future? Outside Yinjing, the 1,000 Black Riders at the foot of Nyodo Mountain were indeed a powerful force. However, Wang Zhikuan had led troops for 20 years. The Yinjing camp controlled 100,000 elite soldiers. Just based on numbers and equipment, they were the best of the Qin kingdom's 5 roads border soldiers. It was impossible that they could not break through the 1,000 Black Riders blockade. The problem at hand was that it was impossible for Yinjing to throw in all its troops. Once the flames of war ignited, Dongyi would only belong in name. The hearts of the people would not be settled. It would probably lead to the Qin kingdom's first true civil war. Wang Zhikuan did not dare to bear this kind of historical responsibility. His position in the military had already climbed to the top. Regardless of what other contributions he made on the battlefield, at most, he would return to Jingdo like Commander Yi and become the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs. There would be some progress in his reputation, but in reality, there were no benefits. For this governor of Yinjing, there was very little room left in life for him to struggle. Thus, he had to think about the descendants of his family and the future. Although the emperor still looked down on the world, he was, in the end, old. There would come a day when he would pass away. If Fan Xian could survive this storm. No, even if Fan Xian couldn't, once the third prince sat on the throne, given his relationship with Fan Xian, would he tolerate him? Wang Zhikuan's brows were furrowed tightly. After all, he was a military commander. He was skilled in strategy on the battlefield, but it was difficult for him to notice the movements and the details. The matter of the Jingdo concubines had not allowed him to understand the emperor's plans. His brows furrowed tightly and then relaxed. Finally, he made up his mind. In a cold voice, he said, "We'll move the day after tomorrow. If anyone dares to stop us, seize their weapons." All of the Yinjing generals had their own thoughts and left the camp with heavy hearts. They were not sure if the military operation the day after tomorrow would actually cause a conflict with the Black Knights. They also did not know if the great prince in Dongyi would actually lead the 10,000 elite soldiers back to the east and directly oppose the Qin kingdom's border soldiers. To sum it up, these loyal Qin generals were worried whether the Qin kingdom's first civil war would erupt in the area under their jurisdiction. Governor Wang seemed to have made up his mind. That night, he went to the main manor and found the leader of the civil officials in Yinjing, Mei Zhili. Mei Zhili was Duke Lu's student. Although he did not have a deep relationship with Fan Xian, he was familiar with Fan Xian. After hearing Commander Wang's sincere request for advice, Sir Mei lightly asked Wang Zhikuan a question. "She is still in Jingdo, right?" Mei Zhili had left his position as the Jingdo magistrate in the 4th year of the Qin calendar and had come to Yinjing. He cooperated harmoniously with Governor Wang's military and political affairs and rarely meddled. Governor Wang deeply understood Sir Mei's foresight and strategy. Just by being able to leave the position of Jingdo magistrate unscathed, one could tell how capable he was in officialdom. The two of them had a good personal relationship, so Sir Mei addressed the young lady of the Wang family as naturally as he would a junior and only called her Zhe. Hearing the words Zhe, Governor Wang's expression did not change. His heart, which had been tempered by the ice and snow of the battlefield, trembled involuntarily. He knew what Mei Zhili wanted to make clear. Wang Ji had entered Prince Huching's manor in June and become the great prince's secondary fae. Before this young lady was married, she had been exhorted to her face by Fan Xian and lectured for a number of months. Other than Jingdo and Yinjing, most people in the world knew that other than Fan Xian's 4 disciples, Fan Xian had 3 other students of noble status. The first was the 3rd prince, the second was the young lady of the Yi family, Yiling, and the third was the young lady of the Yinjing Governor Wang's manor. In the Qin kingdom, filial piety was the most important word, followed by the word of one's teacher. Given the relationship between the Yinjing manor and Fan Xian, the 1,000 black knights blocking the foot of Nyoto Mountain appeared complicated. Wang Zhikuan glanced at Mei Zhili. After a moment of silence, he said, "There is an edict from the palace and an order from the Bureau of Military Affairs. Even if it will incite some discussion in the future, this matter has to be done." "Governor, you misunderstand." Mei Zhili's eyes were focused on his nose, and his nose was focused on his heart. He had already escaped the political whirlpool of Jingdo for a number of years. Originally, he had no intention of participating in this major matter. However, he was born in the manor of Duke and had too deep a connection with Yi Guipin and the 3rd prince in the palace. Although he was currently in Yinjing, if he wanted to escape in the future, it would probably be very difficult. Thus, tonight, he had spoken these words clearly in front of Wang Zhikuan. The teacher-student relationship between Sir Fan Jr. and Ji is certainly worrisome. Most importantly, Mei Zhili sighed and looked at Wang Zhikuan. "You want to send troops to Dongyi, but anyone with eyes can see that the great prince is no longer listening to Jingdo's edict. Ji is a secondary fae of the manor. Have you thought about this problem? If the great prince truly takes over Dongyi and makes himself king, even if you gather 100,000 soldiers in Yinjing and take down Dongyi, what will Zhi do in the manor?" Wang Zhikuan had guarded the Qin kingdom's borders for many years and had suffered hardships. At the age of 40, he had a daughter. He loved her like a treasure and couldn't help being arrogant and willful. This created Wang Tong's bad habits. Fortunately, Fan Xian had forcefully suppressed her bad temper. Every time he thought of this, Wang Zhikuan felt a bit of gratitude towards Sir Fan Jr. However, after being pointed out by Mei Zhili, he said in a daze, "Perhaps Sir Fan Jr. had long predicted the present situation? Is that why, contrary to everyone's expectations, he used his status as an official of Taichung Temple to facilitate the great prince's marriage to Zhe?" Thinking of this, Wang Zhikuan's heart chilled. He had not thought that the Duke would have such deep and far-sighted plans. It truly made one's heart tremble. Wang Zhikuan's position was truly awkward. Although the Yinjing camp was powerful, Dongyi, where its blade was pointed, was already within the range of the great prince and Fan Xian's power. Yet, these two young nobles had an inextricable connection to Wang Zhikuan. One was his son-in-law, and the other was his daughter's teacher. Mei Zhili thought for a moment, and then said, "As for what Sir Fan Jr. was thinking at the beginning, there is no point in you and me guessing now. However, there is something I must remind you. If I can think of the problem here, then the person in the palace can also think of it. Yet, The palace still hasn't done anything to Yanjing. He raised his head and glanced at Wang Jikuan lightly. If Sir Fan Jr. had truly predicted the present situation, then it can only be said that he had great foresight. Governor, you hold the fort in Yanjing, yet you are targeting Dongyi. If the emperor suspects that you are not diligent enough, then no matter who comes, it will probably be difficult to solidify the Yanjing military's morale. Thus, Dongyi's safety will be a bit more guaranteed. My loyalty to the emperor can be seen by the sun and moon. If Fanxian wants to use this, it won't work. There was no anger in Wang Jikuan's words. Mei Zhili nodded and said, "It is clear that Sir Fan Jr.'s arrangements have not been effective. Jingdo has not done anything to Yanjing. In the end, the emperor is a wise ruler and trusts you greatly. Even a military order from the Bureau of Military Affairs and the secret edict from the palace are actually a test the emperor has given you." Wang Jikuan was stern. He raised his fist in a salute and said, "I have learned my lesson." Mei Zhili's expression remained serious. Slowly, he said, "But, Governor, are you really not going to consider Tong anymore? Consider the discussion of the world? If you can truly subdue Dongyi in one battle, you will be a meritorious official of the Qing kingdom. Once civil war breaks out and the flames of war continue, the pressure from all sides will be piled onto your shoulders. But what can I do? If I truly suppress my troops and do not move, I will be letting down the emperor's trust." Wang Jikuan's brows rose. The conflict in Jingdo will, in the end, land on the battlefield. As the emperor's official, there are many things I have to do. I have to do it. If I can't, then I won't do it. Mei Zhili looked at him calmly. After a moment of silence, he gritted his teeth and said, "To say something disrespectful, this is, after all, a family matter of the emperor. As officials, you and I must be loyal to the emperor. If the Qing kingdom truly breaks out into civil war, how will you and I explain to the world? The change in Jingdo should land on the battlefield." However, it is clear that Sir Fan Jr. and the emperor do not wish for this turmoil to spread too far and wide. Otherwise, the emperor would not continue to let Sir Fan Jr. live, and Sir Fan Jr. would not stay in Jingdo as a wealthy and idle person. Those two are both guarding that bottom line. Governor, when you send out your troops in 2 days, please remember this bottom line. You can threaten or invade, but if you really want blood to flow like rivers, I think it is not wise. I'm afraid that is not the result the emperor wants. But the other party is the Black Knights. Those wolf cubs of the Overwatch Council do not know what it means to retreat, Wang Jikuan said with his eyes closed. This is too difficult to grasp. You have to send out troops, but you can't actually fight. You can't ruin the emperor's grand plan, but you also have to prevent the situation from becoming too serious. Speaking of this, Governor Wang let out a deep sigh. He had lived his entire life in the light of knives and shadows, but he had never encountered such a complicated situation. If they wanted to fight, then fight. That was the simplest. Even if the other party was Fan Xian or the Great Prince, if they truly threw the east of the kingdom into chaos, the emperor would not be happy. Since the emperor has a secret edict, we have to fight. At the very least, we have to truly confront each other and suppress the Black Knight's momentum. Mei Zhili's eyelids drooped slightly. The palace's edict must be carried out. Pressing down like a storm on a mountain, how many days can the Black Knights resist? Although they are a group of cold-blooded riders who kill people like flies, the Great Prince is not, and neither is Sir Fan Jr. This kind of situation will not last for many days. In the end, they will have to shed all pretense of cordiality. Wang Jikuan looked at him and reminded, "The emperor's edict is here. I don't want the emperor to mistakenly think that I am not doing my job well. No, there will certainly be an opportunity for the situation between Yanjing and Dongyi to stabilize." Mei Zhili looked at him and suddenly smiled slightly. Sir Fan Jr. has spent so much effort on Shang, and your relationship with the Great Prince in order to seek a balance between the two sides. As for the Emperor's edict, I think he will certainly have a way to end this matter. Although it is difficult to disobey an edict, I do not want to meet the men of the Qing kingdom on the battlefield. Wang Jikuan's brows were furrowed deeply. A moment later, he slowly said, "However, I cannot see any way in the current situation that I cannot disobey an edict and still withdraw troops from Nyoto Mountain. That will depend on Sir Fan Jr.'s methods." Mei Zhili calmly extended a finger. If he wants to continue, he needs a variable. We don't know what this variable is, but Sir Fan Jr. will certainly know. Wang Jikuan sighed and said, "I don't believe he can do this. If he can actually find this variable within 5 days, I'm afraid I will have to be like Shang and admire him endlessly." 2 days later, there was a somber atmosphere both inside and outside Yanjing. The border soldiers that had gathered from various military camps gathered in front of the city and set out toward the east. After traveling for half a day, they had met up with the 3,000 Yanjing soldiers they had sent earlier and arrived at the foot of Nyoto Mountain. A government road passed by the foot of Nyoto Mountain, passing through the golden and bright red edge of the late autumn forest and extending toward the shore of the East Sea. Following this road, the army could reach Dongi. The black mass of soldiers gathered there. Banners fluttered in the wind. The riders wore light armor and had a murderous aura. There were more than 10,000 people in this army. Their aura looked very frightening. However, such a menacing Qing border soldier was held back at the foot of Nyoto Mountain and could not advance a single step. At the entrance of the government road at the foot of the mountain, there were 3 rows of black-armored riders waiting solemnly. There were only 3 rows, a total of 100 or so riders. However, they gave off a frightening coldness as they blocked the center of the road. On both sides of the gentle slope halfway up the mountain, there were 2 even thicker black ink lines. They were also the Black Knights. In order to show his loyalty to the emperor, Yanjing Governor Wang Jikuan had put in a lot of capital for this test. He had sent 10,000 border soldiers. Of course, the governor would not personally lead the troops. The one leading them was one of his trusted generals who had already received a secret order. This general looked at the Black Knights on the road in the distance and felt a chill in his heart. The Qing military had long been famous and envious of the Black Knights of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. They had the best equipment, the best war horses, and the light armor all over their bodies were personally made by the 3 workshops of the palace treasury. Their battle power was completely piled up with gold. There had always been a legend within the military that if the Black Knights did not exceed 1,000, they could not be defeated if they exceeded 1,000. This was, of course, because the generals of the Qing military deeply knew the power of the Black Knights during their cooperation over the decades. It was also because the Qing law and edict strictly limited the number of Black Knights to below 1,000. Of course, there were military generals who were not convinced. The name of the elites of the Qing military shook the world. Regardless of whether it was the Dingzhou cavalry or the Long Arrow camp of the northern camp, they were all illustrious figures. How could they allow a subordinate cavalry of the Overwatch Council to steal all of the limelight? During the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, Fan Xian had led 500 Black Knights into Jingdo and engaged in a bloody battle under Jingyang Gate. The Black Knights were like death gods from the underworld. In front of countless pairs of eyes, they had forcefully torn apart the rebel army cavalry. Those were the elites of the old Qin family. Even Qin Hung had been stabbed to death by the Black Knight spears. This iron-like reality made the Qing military truly understand the power of the Black Knights. No one dared to underestimate them again. They even felt an indescribable fear in their hearts. The Yanjing general narrowed his eyes and looked at the lone rider in front of the Black Knights. From the other party's silver mask, he clearly knew the other party's identity. It was the commander of the Black Knights of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the silver-masked Jing Ge. The Yanjing general's heart chilled slightly. He knew that the commander of the Black Knights was the fierce general who had stabbed Qin Hung with one spear. After thinking for a moment, the Yanjing general led a few soldiers and squeezed their horses' bellies. With a clatter, they moved closer to the Black Knights' defensive line. "Commander Jing," the Yanjing general ordered his subordinate to hand over the Bureau of Military Affairs transfer order. In a heavy voice, he said, "Please make way." Jing silently accepted the Bureau of Military Affairs transfer order. After glancing at it, he said, "We are only under the jurisdiction of the Overwatch Council. Until now, we have not received any council orders, so forgive me for not being able to comply." The Great Prince led 10,000 elite soldiers and was actually stationed in the Song Kingdom not far from Yodo Mountain. However, in order to deal with the court's inquiries, he could not personally lead troops to stop them. He could only give this task to the Black Knights. The mask on Jing Ji's face glowed with a cold silver light. Looking at the densely packed Yanjing army in front of him, he said in a heavy voice, "I am under orders to guard Dongi. Unrelated people are strictly forbidden from entering. If anyone dares to take a step in, kill without mercy." His words were spoken very clearly and calmly, yet it carried an unquestionable certainty. Under orders to guard Dongi? Under whose orders? Sir Fan Jr.'s? However, Fan Xian was no longer the director of the Overwatch Council. As for only listening to the orders of the Overwatch Council, that was even more of a joke. If Yin Bingyan truly sent an Overwatch Council official to mobilize troops, the Black Knights would probably cleanly execute the person and then burn the council order into a pile of black ash. These words made the Yanjing general's heart slightly cold and angry. In a cold voice, he said, "This is the court's order. Are you going to defy it?" Jingge did not reply. After he finished the conversation that needed to be carried out, he reminded, "Don't think about making a detour into Dongi. I don't want to cross the mountains to seize your weapons." After saying this, he pulled on the reins of his horse and returned to the solemn Black Knights. The metal spear hanging horizontally by his saddle shone with a cold light. The Yanjing general took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. Narrowing his eyes, he observed the Black Knights close at hand. After looking for a moment, he had to admit that the other party's equipment was far superior to his. Looking at the weight of the equipment, he knew that the quality of the individual soldiers and the quality of the war horses were far above that of the Yanjing generals. Although there were only 1,000 people, it was easier said than done to charge in with as little blood as possible when faced with 1,000 killing gods. The true confrontation between the Yanjing camp and the Black Knights entered the third day. It was also the fifth day Governor Wang had calculated. There were occasional small scuffles between the two sides. The Yanjing side desire for battle and anger had already surged. Although the Black Knights were few in number, they were still unusually cold and not excited. It was a time of mutual hostility. Governor Wang also felt that he could not endure it any longer. He had to teach the Black Knights a lesson. Because of the Emperor's edict, waiting for 5 days was already giving Fan Xian and the Great Prince enough time to react. If the Yanjing side continued to maintain the situation of confrontation and were unable to enter Dongi, the Emperor in Jingdo would probably be unusually angry. Just as Wang Jikuan was preparing to sign the military order to forcefully enter the Nyoto Mountain front line and launch an attack on the Black Knights, a general suddenly held a battle report with a serious expression and quickly rushed into the governor's manor. Wang Jikuan narrowed his eyes as he read the contents of the battle report. His heart felt a chill. He had not thought that Fan Xian would actually be able to create a variable in the north of the Qin Kingdom. Furthermore, this variable was one that he had never thought of. He knew that his army could be pulled back. He had not disobeyed the Emperor's edict and had not allowed civil war to erupt within his jurisdiction. This should have been a wonderful thing. For some reason, there was not a glimmer of calmness in Wang Jikuan's eyes. They were filled with worry. The military report came from the northern camp in Sangzhou. It clearly said that Shang Shanhu, who had been resting in Shangjing in northern Qi, had suddenly returned to the border. Leading 100,000 soldiers, he headed straight for the southern front. He was already 70 li north of Sangzhou. Today is the last day of 2008. Originally, I had some feelings. Later, I thought about it and decided to leave it for next month when the Qing year ends to chat with everyone. I just wish everyone a happy new year, truly happy. Those who still have monthly votes, please vote. Don't waste it. This is the last month. I want to look a bit more glorious. Tomorrow, I hear that the monthly votes have doubled. I hesitate. Chapter 723. It was late autumn, and the wind began to pick up. The cold air whistled down from the extreme north, sweeping past the wastelands of the North Sea and the endless North Sea lake to the north of Songzhou. Songzhou was at the northern end of the Qing kingdom. It was the closest city to northern Qi. Purely based on geography, it should be southeast of Shangjing. However, because the cold wind followed the North Sea every year and traveled south, this place was even colder than Shangjing. The autumn trees around them had already lost all their leaves, and the fields below the city were busy harvesting their only harvest at the end of summer. Now, the fields had turned into stubble after stubble, and were covered with a layer of frost, looking very pitiful. It had already snowed a few times. Passing the Qing Kingdom fields, the hills in the distance were still covered in snow. It looked very quiet. On the snowy plains, one could faintly see many black dots and northern Qi flags fluttering in the snowy wind. A general on the walls of Songzhou narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. The scouts had long reported back that the northern Qi army heading south covered the sky and covered the earth. It was impossible to tell how many there were. It was probably the entire strength of the northern Qi army in the south. The northern Qi people had come. The Songzhou guards were not very afraid. Although the enemy was powerful, they still did not feel a glimmer of fear. During these 20 years, the two sides had fought countless battles, and the northern Qi people had never gained any advantage. Even though the northern Qi general, Shang Shanhu, had been moved out of the northern gate by the northern Qi emperor and had come to the south, he had not been able to advance a single step through the Qing army's tight defenses. The only thing that worried the Songzhou general was the man called Shang Shanhu. Since 20 years ago, after the Qing emperor no longer personally led troops, the only person in the world who could truly be called a god of war was probably this General Shang Shanhu. This was the glory he had obtained through his years of bloody battles with the barbarians in the north. These few years, the northern Qi army's morale and equipment were clearly far inferior to the Qing kingdoms, but they were still able to maintain a balanced situation in the Songzhou area. It was all because of this person called Shang Shanhu. He used soldiers like a god and was skilled in the art of splitting and thrusting. He did not truly exhaust all of his strength, but he managed to exhaust the Qing kingdom's two border armies here. After years of small conflicts and friction, both sides strictly guarded their borders and did not carry out any truly large military movements. In the eyes of the Qing kingdom, they were only making preparations and stockpiling rations and military equipment, waiting for the emperor's final order to send out troops. The emperor was still tidying up the court. The Qing kingdom's vanguard army was also waiting. They had not expected that before they could attack, northern Qi would come first. Based on previous years' practice, once autumn came, the two sides would stop harassing and probing each other. General Shang Shanhu would be summoned back to Shangjing for his annual vacation. Why had he suddenly returned from Shangjing this year? The ground slowly began to shake. The sound of the shaking was not loud, and the sound was not very shocking. The black lines on the distant snowy hills gradually drew closer in the direction of Songzhou. As the distance grew closer and closer, in the eyes of the soldiers on Songzhou, the countless black lines and the dark cloud-like military formation were gradually broken down into sections of military camps and into specific people. Wearing armor and holding knives and spears, the northern Qi soldiers with faces full of solemnity. The soldiers on Songzhou even felt that they could clearly see the frost on the northern Qi people's eyebrows and their pale hands holding long spears. A tense and oppressive atmosphere quickly spread through Songzhou. Immediately after, it was accompanied by the low shouts of the officers. Messengers holding banners hurried back and forth between the dozen corner towers on the city walls. The Songzhou defending general put down the telescope the palace treasury had made in his eyes. His brows were furrowed deeply. He said to himself, "What exactly do these northern Qi people want to do?" The temperature on the top of the city walls was very low. The words he spoke immediately turned into mist and shrouded his face. Just like the densely packed northern Qi army and horses in the distance outside Songzhou. It hid the truth and made countless people feel confused. The defending general slowly gripped the hilt of the sword at his waist. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the northern Qi people with astonishing power below the snowy hills in the distance. It was as if he wanted to see through their true intentions. Did they really want to move south en masse? The defending general did not believe this because he believed that Shang Shanhu, a famous general of a generation, would not be so foolish. No matter how skillful the northern Qi generals were at using troops, they would not mobilize so many people to directly attack the Qin kingdom in the bitter cold of the end of autumn. This was a suicidal method. Attack the city? The Qin kingdom soldiers also did not believe it. Although the northern Qi army that had appeared outside Songzhou had an astonishing power and was estimated to be 40,000 people, they did not have enough siege weapons. What did they have to take down Songzhou? There were 20,000 elite soldiers inside Songzhou, waiting with their spears at the ready. General, the northern Qi people have already penetrated deep into the country. An officer beside the Songzhou, defending general, reminded him. His brows twitched a little. It was clear he was angry at Songzhou's inaction. They watched as the northern Qi army invaded the country, yet the northern camp did not react at all. The Qin kingdom had not endured such humiliation in many years. The Songzhou defending general did not have any reaction. He knew that his conservative response these 2 days had already made many proud Qin kingdom generals angry. However, he knew he was facing Shang Shanhu. Particularly, the northern Qi military's sudden movement that came without warning like snowflakes made him very wary. He could not guess what the other party wanted to do. The northern Qi and southern soldiers split into 3 groups. Using great speed, they broke through the border between the 2 countries and invaded the area controlled by the Qin kingdom's northern camp. This was a large movement the northern Qi people had not made in 20 years. Yet, before this, neither the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council nor the military's own intelligence network had caught a whiff of it. Northern Qi's 100,000-strong army had forcefully entered the country. It appeared to be a powerful force, but it was impossible for them to directly break through to the south. However, every military operation always had a purpose. So what was the purpose of Shang Shanhu's shocking action? There were 20,000 soldiers inside Songzhou, while the northern camp's powerful strength was scattered among the 4 camps with Songzhou as the center. In front of the city, the 40,000 northern Qi and southern soldiers were aggressive. But they had split up and entered deep into the Qin kingdom's territory. Was the other party not worried that the northern camp would move troops from all over to surround them? It was late autumn, cold, and heavy with dew. Northern Qi's lone army was advancing far away. There would certainly be major problems with logistics. As long as Songzhou was sealed and Shang Shanhu was drawn into attack, the 4 camps of the northern camp would quietly surround them. Other than rushing to retreat, what other choice did these 40,000 northern Qi and southern soldiers have? They couldn't get any benefits at all, yet they had to move so many soldiers and use up so much rations and energy. What exactly did Shang Shanhu want to do? The Songzhou defending general's brows were furrowed tightly. Looking at the northern Qi people who had already begun to set up camp in the distance, he sank into deep thought. He completely ignored the angry expressions of his subordinates. It was already the 5th day. Northern Qi's largest military operation in 20 years was unexpectedly met with the Qin kingdom's most patient response. The Songzhou defending general sealed the city and did not come out. The various camps of the northern camp only waited solemnly as they watched the northern Qi people step onto their land. However, they did not make any strong reactions. This was not in line with the Qin kingdom's pride and blood. Even the northern Qi soldiers, who were silently crossing the Qin kingdom's border and waiting at all times for a bloody battle with the Qin kingdom's army on the battlefield, felt a glimmer of surprise and strangeness. In a small city about 60 li from the border between the two countries, the headquarters of Northern Qi's military operation was set up there. In a private house that had been requisitioned in the city, charcoal was burning in a brazier. The red on the inside seeped through the layer of silver ash on the outside, filling the entire room with the warmth of spring. However, the high-ranking Northern Qi generals in the room were not warming themselves by the fire. They stood by a table and looked worriedly at the flattened military map of the South on the table. Occasionally, they would glance at the person sitting in the grand armchair. Shang Shan, who sat in the grand armchair with his eyes slightly closed. It was as if he was deep in thought or deep sleep. Suddenly, he slowly opened his eyes and asked, "It's been 5 days since the 3 roads entered the country. Has there been any movement from Sangzhou?" The voice of Northern Qi's foremost general was not loud, but it was deep and powerful. "Commander, Sangzhou is still locked in," a general replied respectfully. Following commander's orders, the 3 roads of troops have not gone deep, other than the one in Sangzhou. Who would have thought that our counterparts in the south would be more patient than in previous years? Shang Shanhu stood up expressionlessly and walked to the side of the long table. Pointing at a certain point on the map, he said, "However, the Qing people are all proud and arrogant. Furthermore, this is a proper battle and cannot use tricks. The Sangzhou defending general can at most hold out for another 2 days. It is impossible for him to wait for Jingdo's edict to arrive. He must go out to battle. Otherwise, he will not be able to explain himself to the Qing court. What if they remain locked in the city and refuse to come out?" Shang Shanhu's trusted general asked worriedly. "This time, we've used all of our strength. If the other party holds out for another 2 days, the 4 military camps of the northern camp will see through the truth of the other 2 roads and directly surround them. If we don't receive them in time, we'll probably suffer heavy losses." Not only did the generals of the Qing kingdom's northern camp not see through the truth of the Northern Qi military sudden movement, even the Northern Qi people themselves didn't know why they were suddenly sending out troops. Furthermore, they were braving the bitter cold and such a large risk to go deep into Qing territory. Although this was indeed very satisfying, as soldiers, they wanted actual results and not to pay thousands or even tens of thousands of lives just to walk in front of the other party's city and flaunt their might. Perhaps only the emperor in the Northern Qi royal palace in Shangjing and the silent General Shang Shanhu knew the inside story of sending out troops this time. But who in this world dare to ask them? Although we've been on the defensive these years, don't think of the Qing army as too terrifying. Shang Shanhu's palm landed steadily on the map. The Qing kingdom's northern camp uses Sangzhou as the center. 5 days have already passed, and the other 4 roads of the northern camp have not come to reinforce them. It can be said that they have been stopped by our 2 roads of troops. It also means that the northern camp currently lacks a backbone. A disinterested smile rose to Shang Shanhu's face. The Qing kingdom's equipment and military power are far above ours. If Yin Xiaoyi was still alive 5 days ago, he would have given the order to abandon the other 2 gaps, surround Sangzhou, and swallow up my 40,000 soldiers. However, in the northern camp, who would give such a risky military order? Yin Xiaoyi died, and Shi Fei came. Although that General Shi is not as good as Governor Yin, he is still a powerful figure. The Qing emperor was worried about him and moved him to the Jingdou garrison. Shang Shanhu smiled coldly and said, "Back then, the northern camp participated in the rebellion. The Qing emperor had many misgivings. How do the generals of the northern camp still have the ferocity and arrogance they once had under Yin Xiaoyi's hands?" These years, the Qing kingdom appears to have been accumulating national power in preparation to invade the Qi kingdom. In reality, they have been harming their own national power, particularly in the northern camp. The Qing emperor is a remarkable figure. However, the remarkable figures under his command have died one after another. Shang Shanhu sighed as if he felt it was boring. Since it is so, if my 100,000 soldiers go in and take a look, who can stop me? Being conservative is their best choice, but also their worst choice. It's also the choice they have no choice but to make. However, that clever Sangzhou general probably won't be able to suppress the northern camp's desire to counterattack for long. That is why it will be in 2 days. After Shang Shanhu said this, he walked out of the room, leaving behind the generals looking at each other. The wind and snow had risen outside the room. The snowflakes were not big, but they were fragmented and irritating. Shang Shanhu narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the busy soldiers and logistics officials in the city. A complicated emotion rose to his face. He thought of the emperor in Shangjing and the last time the emperor had urgently summoned him to the palace and ordered him to send out troops at all costs to help Dongyi stabilize. The vanguard of the northern camp was to attract the border army in Yinjing to come to their aid and help Dongyi temporarily relieve the pressure. A chill flashed through Shang Shanhu's eyes. He thought to himself, even if that noble in the south was truly going to turn against the Qing emperor, was it really worth it for northern Qi to pay such a large price? Regardless of whether it was worth it or not, northern Qi would still have to pay a price for this military operation. Just as Shang Shanhu had analyzed, on the 6th day of the battle, the Qing military finally made a valiant response. 2 paths of elite soldiers in the northern camp formed a crab pincer and leaped toward Sangzhou. The other 2 camps sent out all of their troops. Braving the light snow falling from the sky, they charged toward the other 2 paths of northern Qi's army that had just entered the country. In just 1 day, 3 fires were lit. The wastelands in the north of the land immediately became a battlefield of slaughter. Riders charged, bowstrings strummed, arrows flew through the sky, and spears pierced through the wilderness. Fresh blood flowed, flames could be seen everywhere, and corpses lay in the filthy blood. The sounds of killing shot into the dark clouds in the sky. This piece of land, which had been silent for many years, finally became lively because of the northern Qi army's brazen attack. The curtains were pulled back on the battlefield where hundreds of thousands of lives had been entangled. Everyone fought together with great vigor. However, this curtain was quickly pulled back by Shang Shanhu. Without a trace of blood on his body, the Sangzhou defending general walked out of the city under the protection of a large group of trusted soldiers. He watched coldly from the side as his subordinates cleaned up the battlefield. He looked at the arrows stuck deep into the withered trees and listened to the wretched cries of the wounded. His expression did not change at all. As a soldier, it was natural for him to fight for the emperor. However, there was always a chill in his heart that he could not get rid of. Even the joy of a Pyrrhic victory could not dilute it. After a night of forceful marching, the 2 reinforcements of the Qing army's northern camp finally formed an encirclement with the main garrison outside Sangzhou. Before they had time to rest for a moment, they suddenly realized that the northern Qi army seemed to show signs of leaving. The Qing army was mighty. How could they allow the enemy to wander within their borders and then leave so casually? An attack that was not fully prepared began. Fortunately, the border soldiers of the northern camp had fought for many years. The Qing kingdom's military power was very powerful. Thus, such a hurried attack was able to maintain a powerful force of attack. However, the northern Qi elites that Shang Shanhu had personally trained were not easy to deal with. After a large battle, the northern Qi army still maintained their formation perfectly after throwing down over 1,000 bodies. Using an unimaginable speed, they left the front line of the battlefield and valiantly threw down a few camps to abandon, not giving the Qing border soldiers any chance to give chase. This battle, no, it should be said that this strange battle had ended. The Qing kingdom had the geographical advantage and the advantage they already had, so they obtained victory. However, this victory did not achieve the results they had predicted. The northern Qi people ran too quickly. Looking at the captured supplies and rations, the Sangzhou garrison general narrowed his eyes and felt a glimmer of coldness. He finally understood why he had not seen the northern Qi people's siege weapons at the beginning. Even if it was a trap, the other party should have at least brought a ladder. It turned out that from the very beginning, the other party was only prepared to fight a battle and then run. They did not bring any heavy supplies that were difficult to carry, and the entire army went into battle with light equipment. No wonder they did not collapse after the last encounter and ran like rabbits. Why did they run? The highest-ranking general on the Sangzhou side once again sank into deep thought. He knew he was not a match for Shang Shanhu. If he could truly understand Shang Shanhu's thoughts and have a clear target, he would not be as scared as he was right now after winning a battle. The next day, shocking battle reports came from the other two battlefields. The two groups of northern Qi elites had not gone far into the territory. At the same time that the Qing army outside Sangzhou carried out a combined attack, the rest of the northern camp's military power also went out at the same time and killed their way toward the enemy camp on the border. However, the two groups of northern Qi elites ran even faster. All of the generals of the northern camp became cautious. They didn't know what the famous northern Qi general was planning. Thus, they forcefully restrained their subordinates and didn't allow the Qing Iron Riders to use the momentum of the counterattack to kill their way into northern Qi's territory. On the third day, a piece of bad news came. The 40,000 northern Qi elite troops that had escaped from the encirclement outside Sangzhou, on their way back into northern Qi territory, strangely passed through to the east and entered Dongyi's Song kingdom territory. They occupied a provincial city on the Song border. It was said that the troops in the Song kingdom's provincial city did not put up any resistance. Dongyi also did not have any reaction. Thus, they allowed the 40,000 elite troops to enter the provincial city. This city appeared unremarkable and almost abandoned. In the past, no power had noticed this place. Now that Shang Shanhu had led his troops into the city, a large red dot appeared on the map. When the Qing military opened their eyes to take a look, they were shocked to find that this city happened to be right in the middle of the northern camp in Yanjing. It was like a fishbone that pierced all of the Qing soldiers and made them feel very uncomfortable. Was this Shang Shanhu's true intention? In the Battle of Sangzhou, northern Qi had lost and the Qing kingdom had won. It appeared so, but was this strange battle going to end just like that? After another dozen days, the Fourth Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the military's intelligence system simultaneously sent intelligence reports to the various generals in the northern camp. After the northern Qi army of 100,000 pulled back into the country, they did not retreat and rest. Instead, they began to set up camp in the same place. Furthermore, from the depths of northern Qi's vast country, they began to send all kinds of supplies toward the south in an endless stream. A storm was brewing. This was clearly the sign of a decisive battle. Additionally, Shang Shanhu had taken the unremarkable provincial city. The Qing military immediately became cautious. Without waiting for Jingdo's edict to arrive, they had already begun to make preparations to welcome the true battle. The battle might be next spring? In Yanjing, Commander Wang Zhiquan was also forced to pull his attention back from Yodo Mountain and turn it to the 40,000 northern Qi soldiers above his head. He furrowed his brows tightly. He was furious in his heart. He had never thought that the variable Fan Xian had used would be collusion with the northern Qi people. Immediately after, Jingdo's edict arrived and passed into the hands of the high-ranking generals in Yanjing and the northern camp. No one knew what the Qing emperor said in the edict. After the edict, the Qing kingdom's military power in the north began to rest, lie dormant, and calm. Immediately after, the master of Dongyi, Yun Zhilan, sent a message to the world. He expressed the strongest protest and anger toward the northern Qi people's brazen invasion. He said that Dongyi would stand by the side of the Qing emperor and would deal the most violent and destructive blows to all invaders. The most terrifying 13 disciples of the Sword Hut in Dongyi suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where they had gone. Receiving the news, the defenses of Shang Shanhu's camp in the provincial city immediately tightened. Just as the chaos in the north of the mainland was gradually rising, the northern Qi royal palace was peaceful. Imperial consort Li, who was greatly favored by the emperor, looked at the emperor lying lazily on the couch. Biting her lip, she quietly said, "Dongyi has been saved for Fan Xian. The emperor has paid such a high price." I really don't know what he can give to thank you. Thank me? The Northern Chi Emperor laughed coldly and gently rubbed his stomach. That shameless person who is full of evil tricks but always considers himself a saint will probably curse me in my manner for rashly starting a war. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.